The story begins with an old man thinking to himself that he is going to die in a deplorable condition like the one he finds himself in now. It seems that the old man was crossing from one street to another and was caught off guard by truck Sama, and now his life really begins, but in another life. At the end, we only hear a loud crash, and everything turns red and dark. A few months later, in a big city, we see huge buildings, and in one of them, we see Hajime Sakamori outraged, questioning himself about the reason for the drastic change since the company is not experiencing a shortage of employees. With a tired expression, he says he can't take on any more work. Hajime then spots the section chief and asks about this sudden change and if there's anything he can do to reverse the situation. The chief then says it's a direct order from the president and there's nothing he can do. The protagonist keeps insisting, saying that with so much work piling up, he won't last long in the company. Without even trying to understand the protagonist's complicated situation, the section chief just places his hand on the protagonist's shoulder and, with a superior and arrogant look, says that if there are fewer people working, it means Hajime will have to work twice as hard to make up for the lack. Clearly, Hajime becomes extremely outraged by his boss's attitude and can't believe what he just heard. He then continues saying that this is too much and that he hasn't been able to go home and truly rest for 3 days. The chief once again ignores the protagonist's pleas and says he's counting on Hajime to do the work while tossing more papers onto his desk. With a possessed aura, he says he was thinking of giving the task to someone else, but since the protagonist is quick at everything he does, he decided to choose him again. Hajime tries to say something, but he's ignored once more. The chief only says that the president is calling for him, and now he needs to go, counting on the protagonist to complete this task. He leaves, saying that if Hajime understands, it's best not to waste time and finish the work as quickly as possible. As a last hope, Hajime calls for his boss, but it's no use. A few hours later, in the same place, we see the protagonist still in the office, almost killing himself to finish the work. He even considers bringing a futon to the office to sleep right there, but he refuses and wants to finish as quickly as possible to go home. On the other hand, if he keeps working at this pace, he will soon die. Suddenly, Hajime hears a noise coming from the door of his office. Looking toward the entrance, we see 2 people talking about how spacious the place is. The man then says that this specific location is just one of the various departments of the company. Looking more closely, we see that the girl addresses the man as the president, meaning the head of the company where the protagonist is killing himself working so hard. Hajime assumes it's just another mistress. The boss is surprised to see that someone is still working there. The blonde girl asks why on earth there is still someone working late at night. The man simply says he is working overtime. Nothing more. The woman still doesn't quite understand, as everyone has already left except for one. She then compares the protagonist to a school student being punished for doing something stupid and laments the situation. The boss laughs and agrees with her. Hajime thinks to himself that the reason he is still working is because of a certain someone who keeps entering the office late at night with a different woman and mocking the employees. Out of nowhere, the blonde points her finger at the protagonist and asks if he is just another incompetent worker. Obviously, Hajime is outraged by the situation. She then reiterates that everyone has already gone home and he is the only one working in a dark place alone, so he is considered a loser. The protagonist tries to justify mentally, saying the girl doesn't know what she's talking about because she hasn't put herself in his shoes, and the company's workload is far too heavy. The president, being just another sycophant to any woman, now with Eri, his new mistress, says that she has a sharp tongue and is clever. The clever one continues, saying to the boss that it would be interesting to fire incompetent employees, referring to the protagonist, because besides everything, he's a waste of the company's salary. The boss, obviously following the blonde's suggestion, then tells the protagonist that he doesn't need to come in the next day because he's fired. Hajime is completely shocked and can't believe what he just heard from his boss. He then stands up, trying to say something more, but is ignored. The blonde is ecstatic to see an employee fired live. The boss says it was sensational to finally fire a useless employee who was only holding the company back. He claims he did it for the company's well-being, something a good boss should always prioritize. The boss, along with Eri, announces their exit from the place. However, the protagonist is persistent and tries in every way to explain his version of the events. He says that he's in this deplorable situation only because of the high workload demanded by his boss, and if it weren't for that, the health of the employees and the company would be normal like any other. He concludes by saying that firing him for something he didn't do is an act of bad character. The boss doesn't care. Looking at the furious protagonist, he says he's busy and that a low-ranking employee like Hajime has no moral authority to speak to the boss. He calls him useless again. Before leaving, the president says that now that he has fired a useless employee, he will use the saved money to buy a new bag for the blonde. Hajime, in the background with his hand outstretched, tries to say something, but the words don't come out. The protagonist begins to enter denial, telling himself that the president didn't actually fire him, and that he just put on this whole show to act tough in front of his woman. The scene then cuts to the next day. We see the protagonist returning to his workplace. However, he is caught by surprise at the reception when he hears from the receptionist that he was fired from the company. He tries to say that all this happened suddenly and that it doesn't make sense. The man says again that it was an order from the president, and that for someone who is no longer part of the corporation, there's no need to worry. Finally, the boss thanks the protagonist for the hard work every night. Hajime can't even react and remains paralyzed, just listening to what his former boss is saying. The protagonist then finally returns to his home, where he spends some time finally resting and having the beer he wanted so much. Lying down, he says he has already lost count of how much time he spent trapped in his job, and now his house is covered in dust everywhere. With the little rationality left in the protagonist, he still questions what really happened at his job. Because even though he worked hard every single day without stopping, they fired him without any fair justification. And he still wonders, after all, if he is just another mass-produced item that was suddenly replaced. Already tired of all this nonsense, he lets out a soft sigh. The scene then shifts back to the city at night, and then we return to the protagonist's apartment, where we see that the situation is going from bad to worse. The place is full of trash everywhere. Meanwhile, we see that Hajime is completely broke, without money and full of debts. With a completely different appearance, he stares at his work ID and says he urgently needs a job. The protagonist, left with no choices, goes out in search of a new job. Along the way, everyone around him stares at him suspiciously. Soon, he spots a sign saying that just ahead, there is a job interview. At the location, we see that apparently, things didn't go very well, as the interviewer's reactions are far from the best. In the end, the protagonist collects rejection after rejection. Hajime still wonders if any place would still want him to work as just a normal human being. In the midst of his musings, he spots his former boss getting out of a car. Hajime wastes no time and calls him, but to his surprise, he is not greeted warmly. The boss then goes crazy and yells, saying that since the protagonist left, the department has been a mess and now they are full of problems. He even asks what Hajime is going to do about it. Obviously, the protagonist is surprised to hear such absurdity from his former boss, as if nothing had happened. So he explains that he was fired, and in the end, he had no choice, since the president just kicked him out of the company. Suddenly, we see the buck-toothed man step out of the car, complaining about the noise outside the vehicle. The boss, trying to justify his incompetence at work, tells the president that the reason his department has been performing poorly is entirely the protagonist's fault, saying he left without finishing the pending work. Hajime tries to explain his side again, but can't. The president then remembers the protagonist, referring to him as the guy who did overtime. He then says that since the protagonist quit so suddenly, he ended up disrupting his department's performance and consequently, the company. The buck-toothed man says he will forgive the protagonist for what he did. However, if he doesn't agree to return, he will sue him for damages. Hajime says it was the other way around, that it was the president who fired him without any fair explanation, and that nothing he said makes sense. On the other hand, the buck-toothed man doesn't want to hear it and says that if this continues, they will resolve the matter in court. He tries to intimidate the protagonist, saying it could take years for everything to be resolved in court and would cost a lot of money. Furthermore, Hajime doesn't have enough evidence to get out of this unscathed. The protagonist becomes furious. The buck-toothed man continues with his low insults, saying that even if he has evidence, a low-ranking employee like the protagonist can't do anything but crawl like an insect. Finally, he concludes by saying that this time, he will make sure the protagonist works to the bone with tons of overtime and still won't pay him for the extra hours. Obviously, the protagonist wouldn't let the president say all that for free, so he lashes out in fury, telling him not to push his luck. His ex-boss is surprised by the attack and asks Hajime to stop. The president then pushes the protagonist away and says he wants to leave. However, what they did not expect was that they would push Hajime to the corner of the street, a place busy with cars at high speed, and in a matter of seconds, a truck appears at high speed. A moment enough for Hajime to realize that his time had come, and it was not as he had initially imagined. He simply stared at the vehicle in front of him, and then came the impact. Still at the scene, we see that both idiots are still shocked by the small accident. And then, desperate, they disappear from the place. Lying on the asphalt covered in blood, Hajime says his last words, outraged by everything that had happened up to that moment. And what a terrible way to die. Gradually, he loses more and more blood, feeling the asphalt growing colder. The scene then changes from a dark and red place to a vibrant yellow, as if something were on fire. Then, we quickly see an extended arm in a certain location. And as the scene shifts, we see the protagonist with a completely different appearance, shouting that he feels an immense heat. Hajime is left bewildered and questions, confused, what just happened. And as he shifts his attention from his body and looks around, he notices ashes in the air, in addition to being atop some kind of altar alone. The protagonist asks where the hell he is. Suddenly, a giant man with his face painted black and white appears in front of him abruptly, startling the protagonist. And as he calms down, he asks himself again what just happened and who this strange person in front of him is. As the scene changes, we see several hooded people behind the giant man, and they are about to do something. And then it happens. The big man begins to say some words in an incomprehensible language, and his disciples follow, doing the same. The protagonist atop the altar grows even more confused. And as Hajime pauses to think for a moment, he starts to connect the dots. First comes his possible death, since after being hit by a vehicle, it was impossible for him to still be alive. Then he wakes up in a completely different place with people speaking an unknown language. He tries not to believe it, but everything indicates that yes, he was reincarnated in another world. Then we see the protagonist still seated in the temple, and a huge silhouette appears in the background in the midst of a dense forest. Observing the strangers in front of him, they are all kneeling and trembling. Hajime, not understanding anything, decides to look back. And only then do we see why the strangers are so terrified. They simply offered the protagonist as a sacrifice to a deity or giant monster. Still trying to understand the situation he is in, the protagonist begins to gradually grasp what is happening. Well, they weren't worshipping him, but rather sacrificing him to some monster that torments the area. And as we see all the strangers pointing to the offering, the protagonist finds himself in another complicated situation. Shortly before the creature devours the protagonist, he screams, saying to wait, but just like in his past life, it's no use. And he is devoured alive in the blink of an eye. Hajime wakes up in a completely dark place with drops falling on him. He realizes he is no longer in the same place as before, as now it is impossible to see anything, and he barely knows where he is. But one thing is certain. He was devoured by a giant monster, and even so, he feels no pain anywhere in his body, and the most surprising thing is that he has no injuries. Standing in a dark place, the protagonist looks up and asks what is happening and where he ended up. Meanwhile, water droplets continue to fall on his face, and accidentally, one of these drops enters his mouth and he swallows it. At first, the protagonist finds it suspicious but incredibly sweet. He even considers it to be some type of juice, but cannot confirm whether it is true or not, as he finds himself in a vulnerable position. Hajime unconsciously manages to hear a few drops of water falling into a puddle near his body, so he moves toward the sound as quickly as possible. The scene then becomes clearer to us, but everything remains dark for the protagonist. Probably already thirsty, Hajime takes a little of what he believes to be some type of juice on the tip of his finger. He even wonders if this will also be sweet and whether he can lick it. And to his surprise, it is sweet as well. After tasting enough, he looks around and wonders what place this is. But he believes it is useless to think about it, as he finds himself in another world, so everything is unknown. Pausing to concentrate, Hajime says to himself that a lot has happened in such a short time, and that he hasn't had time to think properly. Besides, he is very hungry, and the only thing he has put in his mouth is this type of juice. And he doesn't even know if it is poisonous. But since he has no choice, the only way is to fill his stomach with the strangely sweet liquid, even if it contains poison. The protagonist drinks a sufficient amount, and in the end, he doesn't even care about dying again. And suddenly, when he opens his eyes, he begins to see very little, but he can make out where he is. The place is enormous and full of puddles with strange liquid. The protagonist, sitting, is surprised and questions why he suddenly regained his vision in the dark. Knowing this, he takes more of the sweet liquid and starts ingesting more and more without stopping. And within seconds, his vision returns to normal, or almost, as the place still seems more like a poorly lit room. Looking around, Hajime realizes that he is now inside the stomach of the monster that swallowed him not long ago. The protagonist notices that the monster's stomach is a bit smaller than a gymnasium, but still immense. As he stands up, he touches one of the beast's stomach walls and says it is quite soft. Hajime observes closely and decides to punch it with all his strength, but he is repelled backward. He then realizes that the monster's flesh feels like elastic, and with few choices of what to do, Hajime feels again very hungry, but the only thing he can put in his mouth in this place is the sweet liquid. The protagonist realizes that all this time he has been drinking the monster's stomach acid. So, in another situation, this could have been fatal for his stomach. Regretting what he did, Hajime says that now is not the time to deny what just happened, and is grateful that at least his vision has returned to normal, and he laments again, wishing he could eat something decent. He then begins to walk aimlessly inside the monster, and suddenly hears the sound of something falling. Hajime then turns around and comes face to face with a type of jelly shaped like a drop. At first glance, it seems quite appetizing. The protagonist approaches and touches the mysterious jelly and asks what it could be. Without much hesitation, he picks it up and says where it came from. Looking more closely, it resembles jelly in the shape of meat, but also looks like blood vessels. And again, his stomach makes a thunderous noise demanding food. Staring at the jelly and salivating, the protagonist is torn between eating it or not. But all he can think about is putting it in his mouth and seeing what might happen, as it seems quite edible. And since he drank a strange liquid before and nothing too bad happened, besides having his vision restored, it's worth the attempt. Hajime wastes no time and devours everything as if there were no tomorrow. And at a certain point, he starts chewing slowly, savoring the strange flavor, and it is incredibly tasty. At first, it has a bounce and a wonderful texture, very satisfying to chew. It feels like eating meat, and soon it begins to melt in his mouth. Finally, a juice of some fruit or meat broth adds the final touch. After finishing and realizing he has finally found an excellent food source, the protagonist begins to search for more and more of this mysterious jelly. And so, several days pass. And as in any situation, staying in one place for too long, boredom starts to come on strong. Hajime has been doing the same things for a long time, and he is growing increasingly tired of everything he has seen so far and wonders what will come next to surprise him. And in a few seconds, a thunderous sound is heard coming from somewhere. And as soon as Hajime turns around, he comes face to face with a huge, colorful, and furry spider. The protagonist screams in fear. The spider roars, but it stays still, looking from side to side without any direction. Hajime then realizes that the monster also can't see in the dark, just like the protagonist earlier. So he starts sneaking away. Looking back, he realizes how enormous the spider is. The protagonist realizes that if he is attacked by the monster, which is the size of a car, things could go very bad. And in a few seconds, he notices that the spider is also drinking from the strange liquid, a liquid that restores vision in the dark. And as soon as the monster finishes and locates the protagonist, it becomes enraged and charges toward him. Hajime screams in terror as he sees the monster coming toward him, and now it's too late, because the monster can now see and is behind the protagonist with rage in its eyes. He then runs desperately to any place just to escape the imminent danger. The monster hits the surrounding areas while the protagonist dodges. Hajime screams desperately and finds himself in a very bad situation, and if there is no way out, things could go very wrong. After running so much, the protagonist finds himself lost in a dead end, and now he realizes he has managed to anger the spider even more. The protagonist is left without any reaction. The monster then charges toward Hajime. On the other hand, the boy, with few options, decides to punch the monster without any intention. And surprisingly, something happens, and the spider is sent flying. Hajime is completely stunned to see that it worked. By seeing that the spider in front of him, which was extremely large and powerful, was taken down with just one punch. After this entire scene and that one punch, the spider falls lifeless to the ground, while our hero, already on the other side, was also on the ground, not believing that just one punch was enough. However, after getting up, another spider appears. Noticing this, he stands up completely. The spider then prepares itself and jumps toward our hero. However, the spider was faster, and with just one strike, it goes in the direction of our hero. But the protagonist dodges, moving his neck to the side, which easily causes the spider to, well, break its back or spine, or whatever is inside that monster. After executing this perfect dodge, with another punch, our hero is able to take down this monster. Now, having managed to defeat another spider, he grows angry, as he has already defeated not just one, but an entire swarm of spiders. Tired of this, he throws the last spider on top of the pile of spiders he had just taken down moments ago. However, having spent so much time inside this monster, he developed some sort of sense, which allows him to detect where fresh water might be flowing. Thanks to this ability, he is now able to see slightly better in the dark. His physical abilities have also been enhanced to 100%. Even so, he continues to drink that substance that gives him all the strength and power he has. On the other hand, he notices that these spiders inside the body of the monster that devoured him are incredibly strong and resistant. Last time, we saw him hiding behind a spider carcass. He merely thought that if he hid there, he might survive. That was until he saw that spider with just one strike destroy that previously indestructible body he thought was strong. After fighting these spiders for a while, he discovered that they are creatures so strong they cannot be easily defeated, not even with fire or regular human weapons. Humans wouldn't stand a chance against these spiders, not even in their wildest dreams. Yet, a guy who had spent his life in an office, almost literally as a slave, managed to take down one of these powerful spiders with just one punch. Once again, he begins thinking of a strategy. This time, the strategy is to get out of this massive monster. Now, he prepares a punch and punches the ground, taking down one of the spiders on top of the pile. However, after this punch, he realizes it didn't help. His punch still wasn't strong enough to tear the monster apart from the inside out. He thought this punch might create a hole, but in the end, it didn't work. Once again, another spider appears in this place, but with just one punch, our hero destroys it. This was the 93rd spider he had thrown on top of that pile of spiders he made moments ago. Looking at this massive collection of spiders, he realizes that if more of them gathered, he would essentially be swallowed by these monsters. However, he hears a noise coming from behind. As soon as he hears it, he turns around and finds a crocodile. At that moment, he sees a very large crocodile in front of him. However, the crocodile has two mouths and runs toward him, about to grab him. To prevent this, our hero starts running, but the two-mouthed crocodile leaps in his direction and grabs the flesh of that monster instead. Yet this crocodile was a bit stronger than those spiders, because with just one bite, that crocodile rips the flesh apart, leaving our hero stunned. With this thing, the best he managed to do was leave a mark on the ground. Now, how will he defeat a creature like this? Well, he doesn't have much time to think about it, as the crocodile is already... He was behind him, he just ran. But while running, He realized he couldn't run forever because this crocodile was very powerful. He even thought that if he defeated this crocodile with punches, things would be fine. But everything didn't seem so easy. So he looked for a way to defeat this monster, because if he couldn't defeat it, the situation would be game over. However, to defeat this crocodile, he would need to hit its weak point. Its weak point was its abdomen. So he turned around. As soon as he turned, he stopped. But the crocodile started running faster in his direction. Our hero just asked for the crocodile to come at him, and so it did. The crocodile came and almost caught our hero. However, he dodged and slid under the crocodile, crawling. He then ended up grabbing its tail, and after that, he simply used all his strength. Then he pulled the crocodile backward, flipping it onto its back. With that, he finally had the chance to finish it. The moment was now. Jumping forward, he landed facing the crocodile, and now, face to face, he punched the crocodile's belly. That was enough for the crocodile to die. Well, not so soon, as the creature still squirmed on the ground. To finally end its suffering, our hero raised his hand again and once more punched the crocodile's stomach. Finally, the crocodile ended up being defeated and completely destroyed. After half an hour, he was somewhat exhausted. It had taken 20 blows to finish it off. Its resistance was 10 times greater than the resistance of an ordinary spider. But now he was very hungry and didn't know what to eat anymore. The only thing he thought about was eating something else, as he even thought that crocodile meat might taste like chicken, given that lately he had only been eating that liquid dripping below. He was already sick of eating that stuff. He now thought of changing his menu a bit for the better. At that moment, his stomach growled, giving him a reason to climb onto the crocodile's belly. With his hand, he wondered if he could open it. After forcing a bit, he managed to do it. It seemed somewhat weak to open. But after opening it, he noticed something different inside the crocodile. Until then, he thought this crocodile would have bad-tasting or bad-looking meat. But now, with a piece of meat in hand, it actually looked more like chicken. It was better to think of it as chicken, so he brought it to his mouth. After chewing a bit, he realized the taste wasn't so bad. It was actually quite delicious. It was a bit simple, but it was meat. Now it was real meat, not those drops of stuff dripping from the ceiling of that monster's body. But you know what would go well with this meat? That good old soy sauce. However, while eating the meat with the best taste in the world, he noticed something slightly different. Below, there was basically a light that caught his attention. So he crouched and stuck his hand in there, ending up grabbing something unknown to him. He then placed it in the palm of his hand and began to rub it. Perhaps it was an internal organ, until, out of nowhere, a part of it exploded, and some of it went into his mouth. After tasting it a bit, he realized it was sweet. So he thought he should mix it with the crocodile meat to see how it would taste. So he did. He mixed it with the crocodile meat and then ate it. After eating, he found the taste of this meat marvelous. Now, eating this, he felt like he was eating something rich, as if he were a magnate in the body of an ordinary poor person. But after eating, he realized it was all gone. He wanted to eat more, but it was just a small ball. Still, if he encountered another crocodile, he already knew what he should do. Even so, he started thinking that if he mixed this core with that gooey water, what would the taste be? To figure that out, he looked in the direction of that crowd of spiders that were lying there. So he approached one of them and ended up tearing parts of the spider until he reached its core. There, he found again the same core he had just found in the crocodile. Once more, he put his tongue on it. After tasting it a little, he realized that this one was different from the others. It was tastier and more flavorful. But now he looked up and noticed there were many spiders. Thus, he could collect all the cores these spiders had to add to the crocodile meat. A few days passed, and our hero ended up deboning the entire crocodile. He then gave thanks to the crocodile and the spiders for providing him with such a good meal. Furthermore, he spent several days devouring that crocodile without feeling tired of it. However, he now noticed that his body was a bit stronger. It felt as though he had super strength. He prepared a punch, but veered it to the side. Still, one of those punches hit the edge of the crocodile's flesh. But with just that single punch, he managed to crack the entire flesh of the monster. After doing this, we see Rajam's surprised face as he managed to create a huge hole in this monster. He was stunned. He even stood up, as he now found himself in front of a giant opening. He couldn't believe that his punch, which previously couldn't even scratch the monster, had now destroyed half of it. Now he realized that something was happening again, as the monster began to shake violently. The noise was so loud that our protagonist could no longer stand firm. The spiders were all falling to the side, almost crushing him. Meanwhile, the roar of the monster echoed everywhere. At this point, he realized he was actually inside the monster's body. Yet, he questioned whether the monster was screaming because of the hole he had created inside it. But with all the shaking, Rajam ended up tripping and falling into the very hole he had made. Falling, we then observe him plunging into complete darkness. Shortly after, he found himself in a place completely filled with water. Here, he was surprised to see he was now in a dimension entirely filled with water. But he thought that perhaps this was some kind of acidic juice, so he needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. Even if it wasn't acid, it was water, and in the end, he might die without oxygen down there. Now all he could think about was that he needed to escape as quickly as possible. However, the monster began to move again, making it impossible for him to keep his balance. At that moment, he thought he might drown and possibly die, but none of that happened. Instead, he found himself close to the flesh again. Near the flesh, Rajam thought of a strategy to escape from this place. He stretched his hand backward once more, and then he thrust his hand into the flesh. Doing so, he somehow managed to drain all the water that was there, throwing it outside to a place, who knows where, perhaps somewhere safer. He found himself suspended in the air, happy that he had managed to escape a situation where he could have died. Now, he just needed to relax. Soon after, he also needed to think of plans to escape from this place, given that in the previous minutes, with just one punch, he managed to create a crack inside the body of that monster, so he thinks about doing the same thing again. Now preparing a powerful punch, he ends up kind of saying that he is managing it and that he will get out alive. Then he punches again at that flesh in front of him, but now he finally achieves what he wanted so badly. He managed to create a crack, but at that moment his hand, which was trapped, somehow ended up escaping, and in the end, he was thrown to the depths, to a completely unknown place. However, this place ended up leading him to a crack that allowed our hero to finally escape from that dimension or from inside that monster. Once outside, he can hardly believe that he finally managed to escape. Well, his plan didn't fail in the end, and now he is out in the air. He thinks everything is upside down, or maybe it's just his head spinning. But no, he was truly in the air. Minutes later, we see a beach. He is waking up, opening his eyes, and realizes that everything is now clear. Upon waking up, he thinks that he is alive since he has no injuries or anything like that. Now that he is alive, he feels happy for having survived a dangerous adventure on his own. But now that he is here, he ends up wondering where he is. He somehow managed to escape the monster and make a hole in it, but he doesn't see even a village or any people nearby anywhere. However, it doesn't matter. Now he just needs to find, who knows, a human or someone in this world to maybe make friends with and live that happily ever after. Nevertheless, he needed to have a conversation in person with that one who had made him encircle himself again. Also, he prioritizes wanting to talk to someone. For now, he moves forward, but as he advances, he encounters those spiders again, the same ones he had found inside the monster's belly. However, stopping to think, he notices that this spider was a bit different. Perhaps this is because he was in the dark and couldn't truly see its strength. Now that he is closer, he realizes that this monster was beautiful, but not strong. He then grabs its leg, and with a single movement, he ends up throwing it from one side to the other, smashing it like trash. But after giving that spider a massage, he finishes it off. After all this, our hero then opens its core, thinking that perhaps, due to the spider having a different color, its core might taste better. But upon opening the entire monster, he realizes there was nothing inside. He even thinks that maybe the monsters from inside were different from these here. However, for him, it made no difference. Like what changed about this spider was only the color and nothing more. But this spider, if he wasn't mistaken, came from that direction. So he would be heading in that direction to discover what lay ahead. Advancing then, he ends up finding something incredible. The young man sees a beautiful aesthetic structure. Then he observes a spider, but to him, it looks like it is carrying something. He focuses his vision on it and sees on top of the spider's body a person. The moment he sees this person, our hero starts running toward the human on the spider's back, as he could see this human would soon become spider food. At this moment, he jumps and lands in front of the spider. With a single punch, our protagonist ends up destroying the spider. Minutes later, he uses his strength to tear apart the spider webs holding the human. Now that he has saved that person, he asks if they are okay, while also looking a bit closer. Near, he notices that this human was not injured. He was not evil or anything. He just wanted to know some information, which would lead him to a certain village. However, looking to one side, he notices that other spiders have already appeared. He finds this annoying, but ends up thinking that leaving this here alive would be a hassle for him. Despite being few spiders, these spiders could overwhelm our hero, and for that, he needed to deal with this strange creature as quickly as possible. The spiders leap in his direction, and our hero prepares a punch. With that, he begins fighting the spiders, knocking them down one by one. After nearly defeating all the spiders, he thinks it's all over until another one appears and lands a hit directly on our protagonist. The protagonist ends up being thrown backward. After being thrown back, he gets up minutes later and sees that now there were many more spiders. Now the spiders were close to that human. He asks those creatures to leave his guide alone and to keep his guide alive since he had finally found one and didn't want to lose it by any means. For this, he would be fighting with everything he had to stop those spiders. As he fights against these spiders, he even remembers some animes or mangas he had read, but he doesn't care much about that, as his priority now is fighting these monsters. But whatever, he now needed to eliminate them all, and then spend some time talking with that human to discover new things. Following this, he advances and takes down one by one. Now that he was defeating all the spiders, he might finally have some time to talk with that human lying on the ground. However, he still wanted to know if those spider bodies contained the precious pearls. After checking, he is perplexed as he doesn't find any. He wonders why those spider bodies didn't have pearls like that other monster. He even thought that maybe this was something special, or that he needed to find a spider that seemed somewhat special. Then, one appeared. This might be the strongest, most powerful spider, making our protagonist a bit more excited, as he realizes that this spider was indeed the special one he was looking for. The fight doesn't last long, as our hero manages to defeat this spider. However, this time, he does find that special item, which leaves our protagonist very satisfied. Now, he could move forward. But judging by the fact that he only managed to get the core from that boss spider, it means that the other spiders probably wouldn't have these cores. One thing was different. The small spiders were much faster, but on the other hand, the boss was a bit slower, which helped our hero defeat it more easily. However, this might be the reason why the boss spider had that core, while the regular ones did not. In the end, the fight was somewhat tiring but manageable for him. Out of nowhere, a mysterious shadow approaches him. He then turns to the side where he finds that same human from before. The man gets close to our hero and thanks him for saving his life. At that moment, he asks if the man is okay after waking up. Now that he's awake, the man asks if our hero had gone out to look for monsters like that. But no, he says he was just out looking for some help. In the end, he came across that monster. Still, the man wonders what kind of help he was seeking. He even remembers searching for an adventurer, or something like that to help him. However, he looks back, seeing the dead spiders. He even thinks our hero was a powerful adventurer. But no, he was just an ordinary guy looking for a normal life. Then he starts to explain some things. In his village, out of nowhere, monsters began attacking, and because of that, they were completely destroyed. He went out there in search of villages to seek help, maybe to protect his base. Thus, he wonders if our hero might be saving him. Having said that, our protagonist is happy and ends up saying that maybe, yes, he can help. Despite having saved his life and managed to defeat an entire swarm of spiders, he still truly wonders if he really wants to save his village. Now that he has received this message, he is happy. At this moment, he even thinks about how not long ago he was basically a slave to some companies, but now someone was seeking him out to save lives. Now that he has obtained this power, he might be able to use it to his advantage. So, he clenches his fists and says he is ready ready to defeat anyone again. Then, he thanks that guy again for helping him a lot, but asks him to wait a bit. He begins to wonder if it wouldn't be a good idea to leave all these monsters lying on the ground. So, he gathers them all in one place. Now that he has finally defeated these monsters, we can observe that they might be moving forward, but there is still one important thing left to do. However, as soon as he stretches his hand to grab the spider, it starts to writhe. To defeat it, our hero ends up stomping on the spider's head, which causes quite a mess, doesn't it? However, having done that, the ground begins to crack, which leaves him completely in shock, because this causes our hero to fall deep into the place he just stepped on and broke. So, he falls to the bottom, the very depths of the cave. On the ground now, he sees that he is buried, or being buried, by this earth. Minutes later, after everything collapses, we see him opening some rocks that were blocking his view. Here inside, he now notices that everything is dark. It's as if he's inside that monster's body again. However, looking in another direction, he notices an exit, but the exit is being blocked by some rocks. If he moves them, it's very likely that things will only keep collapsing more and more. He now has no other option, so he begins to move forward. His goal is now to reach the bottom of this cave, which was dug by Zara in the past. He ended up taking some tips from his superiors. One of these tips is that if you follow a straight path and there are two ways to go, always choose the left, as that's where you will reach the place you desire. But even so, he still feels bad for having somewhat promised to help that guy up there. He just asks that the guy up there stay safe because he will be getting out of here at any moment. At the moment, he ends up entering a very large room. He is surprised by this. Advancing, he ends up finding a mirror, but at that moment, he notices there was a warrior in that mirror. He then stares to realize that this guy in the mirror is now basically different. Here, he now has white hair and marks on his body, things he hadn't noticed yet. However, he advances a bit and finds a human skull. As he gets a little closer, he realizes that this human didn't seem to have severe wounds. So how did he die? Now that he died he hadn't even had any kind of accident. He ends up discovering that maybe in this cave, you stay trapped forever. At this moment, he wonders what he should do. He even thinks of becoming a scorpion because, like a scorpion, he could pass through the cracks in the rocks and, in the end, manage to escape from this dungeon he got himself into. But in the end, he sets this idea aside because, in the end, he could suffocate in the rocks, or maybe they would crush him. Now, looking to the other side, if he stays here, he will die just like that other guy. Until then, he notices that in his hand there was a book. With the book in hand, he begins to read what was inside. Maybe he would find something useful, but upon picking up that book, he realizes that the text, everything written there, was basically Japanese subtitles. It was as if someone had printed a book and put it here, this book that he was now holding and reading. But in the end, he thinks it was just an ordinary book. Until then, he finds a page that described how to use magic, which makes him happy. But he wonders how a Japanese book could be teaching him to use magic. However, he ignores this because in this world, there are monsters and powerful creatures. So he ends up thinking that it's worth trying. At this moment, he opens another page where it starts to show what he could be doing to make the magic work. As he goes further, he sees a page that says, "The qualities of mages are something you can easily achieve, like staying a virgin for over 30 years. At this moment, he freezes and ends up thinking that this magic was, who knows, some cheap magic. Why would someone want to become a mage just because they reached 30 years and didn't do that thing? He throws it on the ground, still thinking that this book was mocking him. Well, now he doesn't care about this anymore, because maybe he thinks that the inhabitant who lived here was living in madness. But he was surprised to see that still in this book, there were some things written that only he could understand in his language. However, he continues to read. Well, he wanted to find some way to maybe get out of this cave. However, the book's translation was endless. But even so, the guy did a great job. Nevertheless, our hero was looking for powerful magic. However, he doesn't find it, which makes him in the end tear the book completely. Now that he tore it, he starts to laugh and feel happy. But in the end, he comes to the conclusion that he made a mistake and wasted time here reading this book. Until the moment when one of the pages falls to the ground. As soon as it touches the ground, magic suddenly starts to activate. Our protagonist then finds himself inside a circle. He gets scared to see that something had really started to happen now. Chapter 5 begins as a recap of the final moments of the previous chapter. The protagonist, walking in a strange place, finds a peculiar book near a corpse. Curious, he picks it up to examine it, but to his surprise, on the first page, it is written to forget everything and destroy it. The protagonist, irritated, says there is nothing important and that it didn't help him at all. But even so, those were powerful words. And so he obeys what was written and tears the book into 1,000 pieces. In the end, he lets out a funny laugh, boasting about his great deed. But he soon realizes that tearing it apart didn't help at all. Still indignant and not paying much attention to his surroundings, one of the small pieces of the book's page falls slowly to the ground. And suddenly, a strong blue flash emanates in the place. Not only that, the flash forms a huge symbol around Hajime, who is caught by surprise. He is soon completely lost, wondering what just happened. The light is so intense that he can barely keep his eyes open. And just like Discord's light mode, everything becomes impossible to see because of the glare. In a few seconds, the protagonist regains his vision, but realizes something is wrong, because right in front of him, he sees someone lying on the ground. Hajime tries to strain his eyes to see better, but it's no use. His vision remains blurry. However, it doesn't take long for him to become aware of his surroundings and come face to face with an unknown person. Naturally, the protagonist is both impressed and surprised to see someone. The girl, sensing the protagonist's presence, is also surprised. She says she didn't expect to see a human so soon since it's a rare occurrence. The girl then pays closer attention and understands the situation, even sensing the protagonist's unusual presence. On the other hand, Hajime is left speechless. The strange girl then sits facing the protagonist and says his actions were completely unexpected and that she never thought a human would do such a thing. The scene then becomes panoramic, showing both characters staring at each other without saying a single word. It doesn't take long for the protagonist to understand the situation and refer to the girl as someone important. She then adds, saying she is a goddess. After that, Hajime is left utterly confused and surprised to see a goddess suddenly, especially in the current situation. The goddess tries to explain in a way that leaves no room for confusion. She decides to say that she is basically the author of the book the protagonist tore into 1,000 pieces a few minutes earlier. The girl concludes by asking if what she said makes more sense now. Hajime organizes his thoughts and remembers that after tearing the book apart, an immense glow invaded the place, and then he ended up in an unknown location. So he believes that the book's creator would obviously be present in the place, but he cannot believe so easily that this girl in front of him is a goddess, or the creator of the book. The goddess asks the protagonist if her description has become more believable. The protagonist switches to serious mode, and holding his chin with one hand, says that if the girl were an old, wise man, skinny, muscular, and bearded, it would be easier to believe. The goddess understands and mutters something. The protagonist does not understand. Suddenly, the scene changes, and we see the goddess snapping her fingers, and then some kind of magic begins to echo through her body. The glow is once again intense, and the protagonist starts having difficulty seeing what is happening in front of him. Hajime wonders what is happening, and as soon as the intense glow disappears, we see an old, bearded man in a robe. The protagonist, seeing the scene, is left speechless and doesn't know what to say. The old man then asks what is wrong, explaining that the goddess merely materialized the image of the wise old man he had in his mind, nothing more. In just a few seconds, the protagonist realizes that not only can the goddess perform incredible magic, but she can also read minds. Hajime is quite surprised to discover yet another absurdity. The goddess, on the other hand, shows no surprise. On the contrary, she says that what just happened was a simple change of attire, and that's what a goddess does. Simple. Hajime doesn't want to hear it and yells, saying it's impossible, refusing to believe what he just witnessed. The goddess, trying to prove her point, realizes that the protagonist is one of those who find it hard to believe in something easily and appears to be quite stubborn. As a last resort, the goddess decides to appeal to the protagonist's instincts. Suddenly, she begins to emit another intense glow and disintegrates into small pieces, as if she were paper. In the end, she says the process will be painful. Hajime starts to feel something strange happening to his body as he becomes completely immobilized and trembling. For a moment, he wonders what is happening, but he has no time to think. Gripping his chest tightly and his legs shaking, he can barely remain standing. Falling to his knees on the ground, Hajime feels a crushing and almost suffocating pressure permeating his body. He soon wonders if he is feeling fear, but he doesn't believe it. Yet one thing he is sure of is that it feels as though he is being crushed by his own strength. Still kneeling, the protagonist says he can't endure this situation and just wants to escape this cycle once and for all. After a while, a sound is heard, and everything returns to normal. Hajime, still on the ground, cannot believe what just happened. Only then do we see the goddess in the background, telling the protagonist if he now believes in the situation he's found himself in. With the little strength he has left, he manages to stand up and finally says that now, yes, he believes in the goddess, and that it is something unbelievable. The goddess, satisfied, tells the protagonist that she saw a lot of honesty in his words. She adds, saying that he only ended up where he is now because he tore the book. If he hadn't done that before, he'd probably be lost somewhere else. Realizing what the goddess said, Hajime wakes up and shouts, remembering the book. He asks the goddess what exactly happened, and as if she didn't care, the goddess makes a funny face and says it was a joke. The protagonist, obviously not understanding anything, responds to the question with another question, recalling what happened moments before being teleported to another place. The goddess asks what he thought when he saw the old book lying on the ground. Hajime says he thought it was part of an evil spirit's plan. The goddess asks again, if no one else appeared before him, why didn't anyone else tear the book apart? Clearly, besides the protagonist. Looking at it from another perspective, Hajime is right, since someone from this fantasy world clearly wouldn't dare to simply tear up the book. But with someone from outside, the story would be different. And just the fact that the person who died near the book had the patience to decode Japanese makes one think it must have been something of great value. And because it's something rare, people wouldn't destroy it impulsively. If it were a Japanese person who understood the meaning of the decoding, it would be easier to grasp the joke behind it. The goddess, with a serious expression, tells the protagonist he's right. Someone from this world wouldn't act impulsively. But it doesn't change the fact that, in the end, the translation was a kind of game. Hajime, on the other hand, is outraged at the goddess when he sees her rooting for the next fool to follow the commandments of the book's scriptures. Well, and someone really did follow them. The goddess, planning her next move, does something, and her eyes suddenly shine unusually, clearly reading the protagonist's mind. And there it is. With a smile on her face, she calls Hajime a child, and mentions that he's not a person of many dialogues. But she says that not so long ago, he poured water into an anthill. She then concludes by saying it's a poor taste. On the other hand, Hajime blushes with embarrassment, realizing the goddess invaded his memories again, just to mess with him. Annoyed, he thinks to himself that despite what the goddess said, it's a common act, and almost everyone has done it at some point. Laughing amusingly, the goddess reads the protagonist's mind again and already anticipates what he should have said. In the end, he joins in the goddess's joke. With few choices, the protagonist gives in. The goddess, on the other hand, gets annoyed and calls him cute. With an indifferent expression, Hajime says nothing. The long-haired blonde girl finally says something interesting. She mentions what kind of power the protagonist would like to have. Not understanding much, he asks what kind of power, and if she's talking about magic or something like that. The goddess says yes, but it makes no difference. But since the protagonist didn't reach a conclusion, she'll offer him magic. Hajime, on the other hand, is going with the flow, and he says the goddess is far too casual. And again, as if she didn't care, she makes a funny face with a smile that says she's up to something. The goddess then says it's a very old trick that always works. Just take an old diary and after 10 years its content will seem intact and new. The protagonist, in a way understanding the hint, shouts angrily, telling the goddess not to dig up any more of his past embarrassments. The girl just gestures and says humans are too complicated. With the decision to obtain some kind of power, Hajime tells the girl he wants the power of magic. The girl, making a serene expression, grants the power to the protagonist. And now that the protagonist has gained new power, the goddess tells him to enjoy it and run a test, as it's a rare chance for this to happen again. Confused Hajime, she asks what the test would be. The girl adds that even though the previous tests were a joke, even under strict conditions, he managed to pass, and that's why the goddess will give him one last chance. If the protagonist wins one more game, he will gain double the power, far beyond what he gained just by tearing the book. Obviously, Hajime found it quite generous of the goddess, but he asks what could happen if he fails. The goddess says not to worry because even if he fails, there will be no punishment and he will at least receive the power for having torn the book. On the other hand, Hajime doesn't have much choice but to accept the challenge. And with clenched fists, he accepts. The goddess then agrees and adds that people should accept the goodwill of others without hesitation. The protagonist tells the girl that she is a goddess, so that doesn't apply to her. She laughs and says she likes the exchange. And without much ado, the goddess starts, so as not to think too much because it ruins the fun. She then concludes by saying she will go easy with the questions. The first question is, if the protagonist could choose only one thing to take to a deserted island, what would it be? Hajime makes a surprised expression, and after thinking for a bit, he answers by saying he would prefer to take a cell phone with unlimited battery and unlimited internet access, and he asks if the goddess understands what he means. She then says he doesn't even need to say it out loud because she can read his mind, and so it is done. In the space that fills them both, a yellow glow emanates from the goddess's hand, and suddenly, a cell phone appears out of nowhere and lands in the protagonist's hand, who looks at it intently and seemingly surprised. In the end, the goddess tells Hajime that the test is simple. The longer he survives in the isolated place without giving up, the more power she will grant him. The scene changes, and we see a male body covered in muscles and power. Judging by the premise, the protagonist will obtain the power he desires. Hajime then understands the goddess's message and accepts the test. She then wishes him good luck and, with a charming smile, disappears like lightning. Within seconds, Hajime loses sight of everything because everything turns white, and after a while, he opens his eyes. He realizes he is in a huge blue space that seems infinite in size. Hajime wonders if this would be the deserted island. After walking a bit and feeling the breeze in the area, he starts to find it incredible because it's a vast space, if not infinitely white. Thinking about it, it seems like something out of an experiment, like the Truman Show, if you know what I mean. Soon the protagonist notices he received a cell phone from the goddess, so he decides to take a look. And as soon as we see the screen, it's clear that the battery is indeed infinite, as is the internet. He then decides to take another closer look because the internet is already connected, and it seems possible to play games too. The protagonist says to himself that just with this perk, he could stay there forever without worrying. The scene changes, and we then see him lying somewhere playing some action platform game, apparently having a lot of fun. He has quickly made himself comfortable in the place. After some time playing, he decides to take a nap to recharge his energy. And so several hours, if not days, pass. Then we learn that the protagonist continued playing for several days without stopping. During this time, he managed to finish practically all the Dragon Quest games. Furthermore, he maximized all his characters to the maximum level. In the end, the protagonist says he must have already lost count of how many times he has played the same games. As a bonus, he doesn't feel hunger, thirst, or the need to go to the bathroom. In other words, he is in a NEET paradise. That's why he can play as much as he wants. Next time, he plans to watch all the series and movies on Netflix. And just like the games, he has already lost count of how many times he has watched the entire Netflix catalog. Right after, we see that the protagonist has spent no less than 10 long years trapped in this vast and infinite place. all in white. Chapter 6. Full of curiosity, the goddess then appears to Hajime and asks him what happened and what he is doing. He is surprised to see the small girl appear suddenly and waves back, saying it has been many years since they last saw each other. The girl approaches the protagonist and stares at him for a few seconds, thinking of something to say. Then she suddenly remembers who this person lost in the void is. Hajime is incredulous to discover that the goddess had already forgotten about him, and she shamelessly confirms it. Their conversation continues. The girl says that seeing the protagonist again is like finding a lost insect in a drawer after summer vacation. Hajime obviously doesn't understand the reason for the comparison and ignores it. Moving on to what really matters, the goddess asks the boy how long he has been alone in that place. Hajime understands why the goddess appeared and says she must obviously know the answer since she controls the entire place. Moreover, his phone doesn't display the time or anything. Then she finally tells Hajime that he has been trapped in the void alone for about 10 years. He is completely shocked to hear from the girl's mouth that he has been in the void for 10 years. The protagonist then starts to go into denial and says that it is impossible. On the other hand, the goddess says it is absolute truth. There's no way she could lie. And to confirm her statement, the girl points to the protagonist's phone and says it should show the uptime, probably the date and day it was first manufactured or turned on. Hajime wonders if that would really work. Then the goddess says he just needs to go into the settings to find out. Hajime finally agrees. The girl understands the protagonist's side and says that having been alone for so long with only his phone in hand, he must have developed some kind of attachment to it. Well, Hajime just confirms that it's true. A few minutes passed, and the boy finally managed to access the settings on his phone. After fiddling with it a bit more, he finally finds it. He is surprised to see that the time is in hours and not in days or years. In this case, it shows he has been using the phone for 90,116 hours. The protagonist gets irritated when he realizes he'll have to use his brain to calculate the time and doesn't feel like doing it. The goddess, on the other hand, is just having fun with Hajime. She then says it's just some calculations and nothing too complicated. To simplify, the goddess does the calculation for the protagonist, and in the end, he is extremely surprised to see that he has been trapped in this empty place for over 10 years. Still mocking the boy, the goddess laughs and says she was correct in saying he had spent so much time in the place without even realizing it. Hajime still can't believe it and asks the goddess if what he is seeing on his phone is true about being trapped there for a long 10 years. The girl raises her arms, implying she has always been correct. She says not to doubt the words of a goddess and concludes by stating that even after all these years, the protagonist is still a problem for her. On the other hand, she was extremely surprised and did not expect the protagonist to last so long, as most people barely manage to endure 3 days. Hajime then explains that it makes sense they can't endure even 3 days, and the same would have happened to him if he didn't have something to entertain or distract himself. That's why he asked for a cell phone to do something during that time. In his thoughts, the protagonist says that with a cell phone, he could last at least 72 hours. But he surpassed himself. The goddess, reading his mind, says his goal was already to endure a long time in the void. Hearing this, Hajime tells the goddess to stop reading his mind like that. Hearing the girl's side was more interesting because she imagined the protagonist would last at least 10 days in the trial. But in the end, he endured much more than she ever imagined. Finally, she congratulated Hajime for his effort and courage. The boy was left confused, but the goddess said he had successfully completed the trial. On the other hand, Hajime tells himself that he was just calmly playing on his cell phone all those years, so he found it too easy. The girl, reading his mind again, says it's okay. Once again, he tells her to stop reading his mind so freely. Now that everything is resolved, the goddess asks the protagonist what kind of magic he wants to use. Thinking for a while longer, in his mind, we see a type of elder controlling the 5 elements of nature. And so, Hajime decides that he wants to be the strongest human in the world. Seeing that he finally decided, the goddess tells the protagonist that his wish is, at the very least, humble. In his thoughts, Hajime is left wondering what the goddess meant by humble. And so it is done. As he requested to be the strongest human in the world, the goddess snaps her fingers as a sign of conclusion. On the other hand, Hajime thinks to himself that if the girl can read minds and control space and time, she didn't even need to snap her fingers to grant a wish. Thus, the chapter ends with both of them agreeing. Chapter 7 begins in a frantic manner, as we see the monster from the previous chapters, the one that swallowed the protagonist. As soon as Hajime reaches land, he comes face to face with the giant monster ready to unleash a formidable magic attack. The boy is even surprised to see that the giant beast can also use magic. And without a second thought, it attacks the protagonist with full force, with a huge explosion in the background. Hajime manages to dodge the attack and wonders what just happened. But he remembers the goddess's words and her request, which was basically for him to become the strongest human in the world. This obviously restricted him, making him the strongest human, but in relation to monsters, he would be an ordinary human, as the request only applied to other humans and not all beings. Finally, the boy understands his situation and, in a way, feels excited. Meanwhile, in the background, the imposing beast roars loudly. The scene continues with the monster. However, now it appears irritated by something. On the other hand, the protagonist is already far from the beast, merely observing. He then cannot understand why the monster is making so much noise and compares it to a child throwing a tantrum in a sandbox. For a moment, he thinks the giant creature is fighting another beast. Hajime still feels hesitant. Even as the strongest human in the world, he is unsure if he should get involved in fights between giants. In the end, he decides to wait a bit longer to see where his powers will take him. Meanwhile, in the background, we see the giant monster still tirelessly searching for something, until suddenly, it strikes some kind of structure, shattering everything into tiny pieces. Hajime, seeing that the beast has destroyed what seems to be the roof of a house, doesn't stay still and runs toward the monster with full force, crossing plains and small mountains at maximum speed. In a split second, he turns to the side and comes face to face with a lost boy. He quickly asks if the boy is okay, and only then does Hajime discover that it is the same boy he encountered earlier when he was in danger. The boy, not understanding much, merely says that he is happy to have found Hajime safe and sound, and that he is glad to see him again. The protagonist only says that somehow he managed to escape the danger. Hajime then realizes and asks the boy, "So that's why you found me, to ask me to protect your village?" Well, with the monster completely out of control in the background, the boy responds affirmatively. He was returning home, like any other day, but suddenly came face to face with a giant creature destroying everything in its path. Before the monster actually reaches the village, Hajime plans to confront the beast to stop it. Meanwhile, the protagonist asks the boy to return to his village and evacuate everyone as quickly as possible. And so, he disappears in the direction of the monster, leaving the boy alone. The scene then shifts back to the monster, which is in the exact location where the protagonist was swallowed a few chapters ago, near the sacrifice sanctuary. In the background, we see the area around the beast engulfed in flames. Just ahead, we see the protagonist completely paralyzed, observing the scene. Shocked, he remembers what happened when he first arrived in this world. Without wasting much time, Hajime looks around to see if he can find any survivors, and sure enough, there are. Several people, in extreme danger, are trapped under rubble and defenseless. Some are crying for help. Seeing the dire situation the people are in, the protagonist shouts for them to get out of where they are immediately, as staying hidden under the rubble won't help. In fact, it's dangerous. Some only stare at him, frightened, not understanding what the protagonist meant. Hajime then realizes it's useless, since no one seems to listen to him, as he's a complete stranger telling them to flee. His only option is to face the monster and defeat it. Meanwhile, the beast in the background continues roaring loudly and destroying everything in its path. With few options, the protagonist draws the monster's attention, and within seconds, the beast fixes its gaze on the boy. On the other side, Hajime, with a determined expression, taunts the beast, asking if it's already full and has decided to go for dessert. Seeing the boy's audacity, the beast becomes even more enraged and lets out an angry roar. On the other hand, the protagonist calls the monster's attention again, but this time to lead it to another location. And then we see a panoramic scene of a monster chasing a human. Once they are far enough away, Hajime says they must be far enough from the village now, so he stops in front of the beast, and so the two stand face to face. Now that the tension has reached its peak, Hajime thinks to himself that even though they're far enough away, he will try to buy as much time as possible so that everyone in the village can escape as quickly as possible. Within seconds, the monster makes its first move, and with its giant hand, tries to hit the protagonist, but he easily dodges backward. Taking advantage of the monster being relatively slow, Hajime runs toward the beast at full speed, and when he gets close enough, he lands a punch with surreal power on the creature's face. The impact creates an enormous shockwave around both of them. In the next scene, we see the monster lying on the ground, apparently defeated. Hajime, seeing that the beast hasn't gotten up, celebrates, saying that he can finally fight. However, suddenly, the monster moves and slowly gets up. With an even fiercer look, it roars loudly, releasing an extremely powerful sound that forces the protagonist to cover his ears to avoid greater problems. And as soon as he stops and looks around, he sees that some trees have fallen, and upon observing the village, he notices that many have not evacuated. On the contrary, they are still in the same place, now suffering from ear pain, while others are dead. Hajime wastes no time and, furious, charges toward the beast, which is distracted by its roaring. Once again, with just a powerful punch, he easily sends the monster flying far away. But as we can see, his efforts are useless because even though he does this, the beast only moves locations and doesn't suffer significant damage. In the background, we see the monster staring at him while Hajime realizes that his punches are having no effect. Landing on the ground, he further understands that, unlike the spider, this monster is much harder to defeat. The beast then tries to hit Hajime once again, but it's no use since he easily dodges all the attacks. He then says that if things continue as they are, they won't get anywhere. And even though he finished the test with the goddess, in a way, he's embarrassing himself. On the other hand, it's already time to take things more seriously and unleash all the power granted to him by the blonde girl. Now flying high, the boy prepares his strongest punch yet. However, he is suddenly stopped by a greater force, as he simply freezes at the moment. In a fraction of a second, he notices the monster's movement, but it's already too late, and he gets hit squarely by the beast's fists. Hajime is sent flying far, creating a massive path of destruction through the forest. In the end, he still appears intact, but feels a bit of pain. Moreover, he jokingly says he must have broken a few bones. And as soon as the protagonist stops to think for a moment, he realizes that he was suddenly stopped from completing his punch. He wonders what the hell just happened. Standing up irritated, he says it's not over yet. He then goes all out against the monster. Once again, he prepares a powerful punch, but again he's stopped from attacking and freezes. The beast seizes the opportunity and lands a direct hit on him. This happens several times. A few hours later, lying on the ground, Hajime, irritated by the unusual situation, wonders what is really going on. And because he can't defeat or even hit the monster with full force, he says in his mind that whenever he tries to put all his strength into his fists, he is stopped or blocked from continuing. And even if he spends years doing the same thing, he cannot leave where he is until everyone in the village has evacuated. And so, the boy once again leaps toward the monster with fury in his eyes. Preparing a powerful punch, shouting in rage, he realizes once more that he is blocked by chains. In a fraction of a second, he notices the beast is doing something, and it's nothing good. Still floating, the beast stares at him while preparing a powerful magic aimed directly at the boy standing in front of it. Hajime barely has time to think about what to do, and in seconds, he is hit squarely. A massive purple explosion erupts around the beast, and smoke forms near the spot where the protagonist was thrown. As the smoke clears, we see him lying on the ground again in pain. Frustrated, he says that the beast predicted he would freeze and took advantage of the moment to launch its magic. Still on the ground, with a nervous smile, Hajime realizes that if he can't attack with his powerful punch, What should he do? Stay like this for another 10 long years? Clearly, that's not an option. Suddenly, a short goddess appears in front of the protagonist with a shameless expression and immediately apologizes, saying she was wrong. The boy notices the girl's presence. She then says that instead of stopping to explain what's happening to the protagonist, she'd rather show him right away. She grabs the boy's hand, and an enormous source of magic surrounds them both. In mere seconds, a massive yellow lightning bolt rushes toward the monster, giving the beast no time to react. It is struck directly, evaporating into the air as if it were ashes. And so, the protagonist's main problem, which had troubled him all this time, was almost solved. As the damage was already done with that monster, he begins to notice that his tattoos are disappearing, which surprises our hero greatly. But for the goddess, it was no big deal, as the monster was defeated. And since he was a sacrifice, defeating the monster caused the tattoos to completely vanish from his arm. However, now he wonders what she was doing in that place. To this, she simply says that she is a goddess and can go wherever she wants. But our protagonist didn't mean it that way, as she had just stated to us. She begins to explain 3 reasons why he couldn't fight and use his powers. The first reason was that he gained such a massive amount of power that his body couldn't handle releasing it all. She just had to remove the blockage that was clogging his power. Now he wonders what the second reason is. The second reason was the easiest of all. She was bored. At least, that's what he thought. But then she reads his mind again. Our hero simply asks her to stop reading his mind again. But this goddess comes up with another topic. The longer you stay in a certain battlefield, the more power you will gain. Though he hasn't given up yet, this was true. However, he asks her not to be so vague, as she could have given him some tips or warned him that some tests weren't over yet. She then starts laughing at our hero and asks if he still doesn't want to give up on that redemption of gaining more power by enduring a certain kind of test. For him, it doesn't make sense anymore, since he just left that dimension. And she agrees with the things she should have remembered before canceling the test, since he managed to pass almost everything. But anyway, she still wants to continue with the test because she still wants to watch some things that our protagonist will be doing in this world here. However, they could fix the current situation, as in the judgment from 10 years ago, he ended up receiving a huge power, but the challenge hasn't stopped. This means that his power could be increasing more and more, and his power will only stop growing until the moment he presses the surrender button. After saying this, she simply affirms that, yes, that's fine with her. However, what the goddess wants to know more about is that he will be talking with her regularly for a good while, but if necessary, she will use her power. He doesn't understand, so she explains that if he dies once, she will increase the life of our hero, allowing him to live a bit longer than usual. Happy with this news, he ends up wondering if there's something more he could do to make her enjoy herself a bit more, which surprises both of them. She was about to do something, but they are interrupted by the villager who had arrived in the middle of their conversation, asking if he managed to defeat the monster. They affirm to the villager that yes, they defeated the monster. With tears, the villager thanks our protagonist, but thanks again, grabbing his hand, thanking him for protecting him and his village. After thanking him this way, he has some memories of the past, of that life where he was, let's say, enslaved. He then smiles when he realizes that everything has changed now. He no longer lives that slave life. After he thanked him, he said it wasn't anything special. He just did the basics. But still, he ends up inviting our hero to go to the village, as the village wants to thank him for his action. Meanwhile, we have a doubt about the heir here. Was she the goddess? Well, the goddess for some reason was not seen by the villager. She simply said she was a goddess and could not be seen by people of this world, nor could she be heard. But since they talked about it, they ended up heading to the village. Once there, he learns more about that monster. That monster was the Lord of the Forest, who made this forest his territory. But now that it has been defeated, the villager has nothing more to do because before, the villager sacrificed people to make the village stay at peace for some time. After all this happened, he went out to look for a hero strong enough to kill the monster, and for some reason, he found the protagonist. Still, as someone who was used as a sacrifice, it's natural for him to resist and not want to protect the village, but the sacrifices were called to protect the village. He even wonders how strong the village chief was. To this, the villager says the village chief was incredible, but after the monster's attack, some people from the village were injured. What really happened was that the village was totally destroyed by that monster, so now they have no place to stay. What the villager was thinking at that moment was that our hero wanted money, but the goddess noticed that our hero was satisfied and happy for someone thanking him. He didn't care about the money. However, seeing this action, she will do something for our protagonist. For this, she simply asks him to imitate her. He then imitates her, starting to snap his fingers back and forth. And soon after, we see the destroyed house and devastated crops starting to evolve, going back to normal, to their natural state. The people, seeing this, are clearly shocked. The villager who had come for help opens his mouth in surprise, while our protagonist is also surprised to see the village fully restored with a simple hand movement. Soon, the villager realizes that it was our protagonist who did this and thanks him again. Now, everyone from the village approaches our hero and sees that he really is the hero who is going to protect the world. So she approaches him with happiness more than 1,000 times. But the goddess asks him to keep his head held high, because this thing is the one that makes the gods happy, and also something that ended up being somewhat transmitted by our hero, and this power of his was also hers. In the next moment, people gather closer to him, now surrounded, and he has nothing more to do. So he declares to everyone that what just happened was an ability he just used. As soon as everyone hears this from his mouth, they all scream with happiness, and then the villagers end up offering him a lot of food, really a lot of meals. It's like a banquet, as a way of thanking him. The goddess even asks him to accept this form of gratitude without being able to refuse the offer. He has to accept, leaving both the goddess and him very happy. She even knew he would say that, and for this reason, she says that he was more than interesting. Like the things she wants were obvious in the protagonist. It was as if she were him. And anyway, this goddess ends up affirming that if he follows some things she needs to do, she will give our hero some extra powers. However, our hero reaches a point where he realizes that if he receives too much power, he might end up becoming a god of this world. But now he leaves that talk for later because it was time for the meal. As they gather around the table, everyone begins to sing, others offering him the meal he wanted, while we observe everyone thanking our protagonist for saving the village. If it weren't for him, it's very likely that everyone here would have already perished. Standing at the table, everyone bows to our hero for having protected the village, and this was the most they could do now. Looking at this, he has a memory. The memory of that life before reincarnating in this world, where he worked as an animal, in the end, receiving not even a thank you. But his heavy thoughts are interrupted by some children who again approach him and once again thank our protagonist for his actions in protecting the village. After that, everyone leaves, and the village begins to develop with a great celebration. The night falls, and the next day we see him waking up, still a bit hungover. He wakes up, but at that moment he looks up and finds that goddess above him, which makes him startle and ask her to leave. We then see someone entering through the door. This was that villager from before, and he offered our protagonist a kind of breakfast, since he had drunk so much alcohol the day before, thinking it might help him recover from the hangover. But at that moment, our protagonist begins to hear some noises, and so does the goddess. They wonder what was happening. So everyone goes out to see what really happened. They then see everyone from the village running to somewhere safe. He asks what was happening, and she affirms that many dangerous spiders were appearing in the village. As soon as he hears this, he grabs some kind of weapon to try something. He would at least try to destroy these spiders, since they had just fought a powerful monster that almost destroyed their village, and he wasn't going to let these spiders destroy it again. Facing one spider, he tries his luck. But at that moment, our protagonist steps in and asks him to let him finish off the monster. He hesitates, but eventually agrees. Our protagonist then punches the monster, quickly destroying it. One wasn't enough, so he attacks each of the monsters in front of him, destroying every one of them. The villagers, once again, are left speechless as they watch our protagonist destroy each of the monsters. Minutes later, he piles up the defeated spiders and thanks the people who helped him carry the monsters. But now, this guy is wondering what they would do with these monster carcasses. He tells them not to worry, but the villager is already surprised to see monsters like these suddenly attacking the village. which was rare. For this reason, our protagonist even speculates that it was because he defeated that powerful monster. But he leaves that idea for later. Now he opens up the spider and begins searching for the things he desires most, that pearl. Before digging, he ends up finding it, and, unbelievably, he finds it on the first try. As soon as he holds that thing in his hand, we then observe the face of the villager. The villager wonders how he managed to do it, or if by chance he knows how to recover this kind of thing. Well, to really find out if he knows or not, after a little while, we're finally back with a continuation for you all. The story continues with the protagonist surprised, looking to the other side, wondering if what he was holding was expensive. Looking at it now, he realizes that maybe the protagonist doesn't know what Frisia is, and he asks what exactly it is. Only then does someone start explaining that it's an extremely rare item, only obtainable from monsters on very rare occasions. It's great. It can increase vitality, cure various diseases, and be used for many other things. After hearing all of this, that goddess appears, asking if by any chance he wanted to use it. If he wanted, she could fill that hole in the house to the maximum. However, the protagonist is against it, because if too much of this item were introduced into the world, its value would decrease. Then he points at him and asks if he wants it. He ends up saying that it wasn't exactly that, he just wanted that thing in the protagonist's hand, not for his own use, but to take it to a certain place where only the rich reside. There, people would pay an extremely high price to have this pearl in their hands, and they would use the money they earned from it to survive the winter. Looking at it now, he is surprised at how valuable this thing really is. However, the protagonist, who had already collected many pearls like this, ends up giving it to him. He stands still, not understanding, and only after a moment does he realize with shock that the protagonist was really giving him the pearl. After receiving it, he worries, asking the protagonist if he was really giving it to him. The protagonist says yes. After all, he doesn't want to use it anymore. Grateful, he thanks the protagonist, then turns to the rest of the villagers. When everyone sees this, they are wide-eyed. Then, all at once, they celebrate, knowing they will be able to survive the winter. The protagonist, on the other hand, also celebrates. He is happy in his mind. But suddenly, the goddess looks in another direction, making the protagonist wonder what was happening. Then, out of nowhere, a carriage appears. This carriage came from afar, but it was clear that it belonged to someone very important, because there were many guards alongside it. The villagers who saw it from a distance could tell that this carriage belonged to the Lord. They then wonder what he came to do here. After some time, he tries to open the carriage door, making everyone there nervous. A guard finally steps in and opens it. After a long while, their lord finally steps out of the carriage. At that moment, he comments that this village was too poor. However, as the protagonist looks at him, he realizes that this guy is quite similar to that garbage lord from Anis. Then, one of the villagers approaches the lord and asks what he is doing in the village. He then reveals that it was very likely that the chief of this village was dead. He could try to hide it, but for him it was impossible because he keeps track of all the village chiefs within his territory. That's the only way he can know. The protagonist assumes that maybe he is using some kind of magic. But now, the Lord changes the subject and starts wondering who will be the next village chief. What matters most isn't knowing who the chief will be, but rather how they will manage to pay the taxes he imposed. One of the villagers ends up asking him to wait a little. The chief had died just a few days ago. They hadn't even had time to prepare to pay so many taxes. The Lord then turns to this villager and asks what that has to do with him. Watching from a distance, the protagonist really realizes that this guy is literally their CEO. But the Lord continues, saying that they are in his territory, and if they want to survive in the coming days, they will have to pay taxes. While he talks about this, he focuses on another person, specifically the elder from before, the one who had taken the pearl from the protagonist. He approaches, and as soon as he does, he grabs what was in the elder's hand. The moment he grips it, he realizes that this is that rare item. Looking around, he confirms that it does indeed come from those spiders. Only then does he start praising everyone in the village. Now that he had gotten what he wanted, he no longer needed to stay there. In fact, he could leave, and maybe, in the future, even increase the taxes further. as he now realizes that this village is producing arashia. With this arashia, they should have just enough to survive for a month. After hearing something like that, everyone is shocked by what he says. The protagonist immediately becomes irritated because what he had in his hands was something he was going to sell elsewhere to survive in that village for at least a month. However, now this servant has proposed a new idea to them. They will have a year. In that 1 year, they will have to obtain another one of those tokens. As soon as they manage that, he will be able to lower the salt tax slightly. However, complaining, he ends up demanding that everyone shut up. They were born in that territory and ate the things that came from it, so they had no right to say anything. Then, he approaches an old man and suddenly slaps him, pushing him backward until he falls to the ground. He then states that if anyone dares to disobey his orders, he will make sure that everyone in the village ends up in the same place as their leader. The guards prepare themselves, while those present ask who would be crazy enough to try something against him. Everyone in the village stands still, as they are not foolish enough to act, but someone is. That someone is the protagonist, who now steps forward. Seeing this, they ask what he wants. He responds by mentioning a contract. The villagers pay taxes, but in return, what exactly is the Lord doing for them? However, the Lord ignores his question and instead remarks that he is a foreigner. What was he doing in their territory? The protagonist reveals that this is irrelevant at the moment. Even if he is a foreigner, what he sees happening here is unjust to the villagers, which completely infuriates the Lord. A foreigner speaking out more than he should. This is unacceptable. Yet the Lord raises his arms and states that yes, the people pay taxes, but in return, he grants them something even more valuable: freedom. They can dance and celebrate whenever they want because they live in his territory. Everything in that place belongs to him. So those within his lands must obey him, or he will kill them all. As he continues saying increasingly absurd things, the protagonist, angered by his words, clenches his fist and then punches the Lord in the face, making him stumble backward. A moment later, the entire village is left speechless. The elders, the guards, everyone. Meanwhile, the servant who had been speaking earlier is sent flying, spinning like a top before crashing to the ground. The guards immediately prepare to attack the protagonist. However, unwilling to stand still, the protagonist moves swiftly, and with just a few motions, he manages to take down every single one of the guards. Afterward, he realizes that these guards were much weaker than the spiders he had previously faced. Now that he has defeated them, he pauses, reflecting on his actions. He shouldn't have done this. He has just taken down a powerful figure. The villagers might now suffer repercussions. To prevent this, he decides he must draw the attention of those at a higher level so that the village does not end up suffering at the hands of these powerful figures. Looking ahead, he notices that the entire village is overjoyed. One of the leading villagers approaches and asks if the protagonist could lend them his strength. They want to become independent from this man. If he helps them, they will be eternally grateful. Independence. That might actually be an incredible idea. The Lord previously claimed that the people paid taxes in exchange for protection, but in reality that wasn't the case. For the villagers, it would be better to be independent. In many places, powerful people rise within villages, becoming lords who rule over them. In this case, it could involve multiple villages coming together under a single feudal lord. Now, the protagonist views this world differently. In his past life, he didn't live under the rule of a single leader. Now he realizes that he has the ability to stand on his own in dangerous situations. Only after some time does he finally tie up the guards and the Lord himself. With the Lord restrained, he wonders what he should do next. Suddenly, the Lord speaks. "How much do you want?" The protagonist is surprised by this, as the Lord is offering to pay whatever amount is necessary for his release. But the protagonist responds that ransom is not what he had in mind. Just as he says this, an elder interjects, commenting that captured individuals from the higher ranks often pay hefty sums to secure their freedom. At that moment, the protagonist doesn't know how much he should demand for the ransom, or even if he should demand one at all. In a situation like this, he would love to satisfy his pride, but even if he were to obtain the money, would it truly be worth it? Wouldn't even improve his treatment a little bit, neither him nor that lord from here. because if he manages to escape from here in any way, he will come back to mistreat those people once and for all. Only he will stop if that pride he has is completely crushed. Only then will they truly achieve independence. However, stopping now to think, he ends up coming up with an idea. Then he asks Dean what the currency here is. So Dean tells him the lowest price. He has already decided on the ransom. Now he will be paying a note. A money note from this world. The moment he talks about this, the Lord is in disbelief. The village elders wonder what he is trying to do, since to ransom him he only has to pay a single note. However, the Lord gets irritated and asks himself how he could make such a crazy deal like this with him. He ends up somewhat letting it go. If he really wanted to be freed, it was better to pay a single note quickly. So he withdraws, angry. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the goddess asks herself, "A note! Why did he set that as a ransom?" For him, it was simple. He only demanded a single note. But basically, there were two ways to think about it. On one hand, he was furious, thinking that he was worth only a single note. On the other hand, he thought that he should just pay that note to survive. But even so, the goddess thought that this wouldn't work. The protagonist, however, thought differently. He knew this type of person, and this type of person is very greedy. That guy was most likely a very proud man, and his public image was what he valued the most. If he accepted just a single note, it would basically mean accepting immense humiliation. The goddess starts wondering, what if he refused to pay a single note? Since, for him, a note was too little, would he try to offer a higher price instead? However, the protagonist comments that everything was fine, and he was sure that the Lord wasn't even thinking about these things at the moment. Then, one of the villagers appeared, shouting for the protagonist to wait a moment, because that Lord had been shouting for a while that he would pay a single note. And so, the villager asked for him to be freed at once. After hearing this, the protagonist says he will go to where the Lord is. And as mentioned before, it was very likely that he was right. The Lord was the type of person who cared more about collecting taxes from people. Once he was tied up and forced to endure even a bit of the suffering that the villagers lived through, he would completely give up. Because looking at that guy's face, it was clear that he couldn't even live a little in an uncomfortable place. But for our protagonist, the real fun was just beginning. On the other hand, the goddess only watches and finds him intelligent. Back at the camp, we see the Lord begging for freedom. The protagonist says that he will release him, but he must pay that one note. If he doesn't pay, he won't be freed. The Lord, irritated, says that he is a noble and does not have that coin in his pocket. So he would have to ask his family to send him that coin so that he could be freed. This makes the protagonist quite curious. He is arrogant, and now he wants to be clever. The protagonist even asks if he has any awareness of the situation he has gotten himself into. He has no money in his pocket. So how would he pay for something like this? Without a choice, he would really have to opt for the other option. At the very least, he would have to write a promissory note. Maybe this would work. A promissory note? They ask. The protagonist replies that if he writes a promissory note, he will make an exchange for his release. If that was what he wanted, he should have said so from the beginning. So, he will do it. The protagonist, with a face that doesn't understand a thing, is simply pleased. Then, he turns to Odon and asks if he has any paper. Odon responds that he does, but he needs a pen. So the protagonist asks if he has a pen to at least lend him. Odon refuses to lend it. So the protagonist turns to Dean and comments that he would need to buy one. But then, Dean reveals that it wouldn't be very useful, since it would take 6 days to reach the city, buy one, and return. So, they have no choice. They would have to be doing that. Our protagonist asks them to wait at least a week. When he returns, he will have his freedom. As he leaves, he asks them to wait a little while. After a long time, he ends up handing the pen to him, but for that, he also gives him a pocket knife. However, Odon wonders why he would give him that. Our protagonist responds that there is no need to worry. He does not have enough strength to fight against him. He also asks Odon to go to the city and spread the word that their lord, the Lord, cannot pay a ransom with a single bill. After some time, he releases that lord. Then he asks him to take a piece of paper and sign that agreement. Only with the signed agreement would he be able to leave this territory. At that moment, he takes the knife, alarming everyone a little. However, He only wanted to free his guards. Everyone, not understanding, simply agrees with it, especially since the Lord does not even have the chance to cut his finger to use his blood as ink to sign the contract. So, he needed one of his guards. Thus, he released one of the guards, cutting a bit of his finger and using the guard's blood as ink to sign the contract. Only after signing the contract does he take it and hand it to the elder. However, he asks that at least the protagonist verify twice to ensure that the contract is correct. Our protagonist tells him not to worry. If he is lying, they will spread throughout the entire city that his lord does not even have enough money to pay a ransom with a single bill. In the end, he releases the man who flees in his carriage. However, he promises that he will return for revenge. The protagonist, understanding something else, says that he can come back here again. Who knows? Maybe next time he can arrange an even cheaper ransom. Suddenly, the elder appears from behind and starts wondering if this promissory note is really enough. Looking at the paper, he realizes that this note is promising and will work as a barrier for this village. He even wonders if that man will attack them. But the protagonist tells him not to worry. The man is too concerned with his public image. Now, imagine someone like him being exposed to the world as someone who couldn't pay a cent for a ransom. How would people react? As a result, maybe even other lords, or even his own lord, would despise him. If it is not true, they can simply show this written paper. That alone would be enough to prove everything they need. A note, a bill that was worth almost nothing, could, in the future, become something much greater. This thought makes all the villagers happy with the protagonist. In the end, everyone salutes him. But now, they need to focus on something else. Raising money to finally gain independence. After some time, we see the protagonist walking through the forest. While walking through the forest, he realizes that his hair has grown quite a bit in this short period of time. Because of this, he needs to cut it. Suddenly, a goddess appears beside him, commenting that humans are quite inconvenient. Since she is a goddess, she does not need to worry about such things. She can grow or shorten her hair whenever she wants. She also mentions that when men reach their 30s, they often face baldness. However, since she does not like to see the protagonist in that situation, she blesses him with a new ability, one that will prevent him from ever going bald. Upon hearing this, he turns his head as fast as he can and simply thanks her for her kindness. While wasting time talking, the protagonist senses the presence of a monster. He turns and sees that it is one of those spiders. As soon as he spots it, he jumps and, within minutes, lands a kick that knocks the spider down. However, after defeating it, he realizes it was not what he was looking for. He was searching for something that would give him more of that mysterious pearl. The goddess, however, thinks that pearl has many beneficial properties for the human body. But to form that type of pearl, certain conditions must be met. She begins explaining that sometimes, inside living beings, there are many nutrients. These nutrients accumulate in a certain place, eventually forming this pearl. This substance is more commonly known as essence, or more famously as pufferfish venom. Hearing pufferfish, the protagonist freezes because he knows very well how dangerous its venom is. But the goddess tells him not to worry. This venom is not harmful to humans. One of the reasons the protagonist has developed high poison resistance is because he has eaten many of those pearls. After talking for a while, the protagonist continues walking. Eventually, he encounters another of those spiders. With his skill, he manages to take it down. Then, he starts searching for the pearl. After looking for a long time, searching here and there, he does not find one. Only late in the afternoon does he finally manage to discover one. He met the goddess. He asked if he wasn't going to eat, and he commented that these were military supplies. Since the village needed to become independent, many conflicts would arise, so they needed weapons and other things to defend themselves. In the village, it was very likely that not a single person had proper combat training. Armor and that sort of thing were quite useful for protecting people from attacks by others. The goddess understood, but wondered why he was so confident in hand-to-hand combat. Our protagonist didn't understand too well. Moreover, she questioned why he wasn't using his magical power to take down the weaker monsters. To demonstrate, or perhaps to explain why he wasn't using his magic, he formed a sphere of energy in his hand, and then fired it into the forest, managing to destroy a large portion of it. The blast shot up into the sky, and only then did he reveal the reason to her. She understood that he couldn't control his own power. Humans really were difficult. Curious, he asked if the goddess could control her powers, since he had doubted her. A little, she wanted to demonstrate how to properly control power. Using her magic, she directed it toward the guy's chest. He immediately asked her not to use her power on people. Hearing that, she simply laughed. Then, the protagonist asked her not to waste her energy on useless things. However, another spider appeared in front of them, which irritated him. He wondered why there were so many spiders. The goddess replied that he had destroyed the spider's nest. He understood then. Now, our protagonist wanted to try using his magical energy. To do that, he needed to imagine a faucet, as if he were turning off a water tap. When he said that, the goddess commented that it made a lot of sense, that it was just like that. But for this to work, he needed to slow down the spider a bit since it was eager to attack him. The protagonist tried to focus, and once he did, he finally achieved what he wanted. Energy surged from the palm of his hand. After a moment, he fired it in the spider's direction, hitting it completely. With a single strike, our protagonist managed to blow its shell apart. However, he was thrown back, falling to the ground. When he looked ahead, he saw that the spider had been blown into 1,000 pieces, some of them landing on him. Finding that disgusting, he went to a nearby river to bathe. Since he couldn't control his power properly, he ended up in this situation. After some time talking with the goddess, he realized his hair had grown too long. So he took out his knife and started cutting pieces of his hair. As he snipped here and there, a strand fell to the ground. The moment it touched the ground, it exploded, startling the protagonist. He looked back, and the goddess began explaining some things. His hair, when cut, released some kind of energy. She should have told him that earlier. She continued explaining that his hair had a certain biological concentration mixed into it since, in the end, the protagonist was an irregular in this world. After thinking about it, he came up with an idea to deal with the monsters more easily. He ran deep into the forest, attracting the monsters' attention and luring them to a specific location. Once there, he pulled out a strand of his hair and placed it on the ground. The moment he did that, he quickly withdrew. As soon as he moved away, the monster stepped on the strand, and a moment later, an explosion completely destroyed it. And so, in the end, he managed to defeat the monster without putting himself in danger, thanks to this brilliant strategy he had just come up with. And our story continues from the previous chapter. At this moment, the goddess is surprised to see that his hair explodes upon being touched, or when something touches it. But she also wonders if by chance, the hairs that fall out naturally without being pulled would explode the same way. To this, he responds that no, the ones that fall naturally are useless. Even she finds them useless. However, the protagonist asks her not to say such things, but then she reassures him, saying not to worry because his hair will not fall out. After all, she has bestowed upon him the blessing of baldness resistance. After some time, we see him realizing that he now understands which hairs explode and which do not. The goddess then asks what the problem is. He explains that these hairs explode after a certain period of time, but only after leaving his hand or upon impact with something. However, even if they explode, they are still just hairs, because even if he were to throw one of his hairs, it wouldn't fly very far. This means they are as fragile as landmines. So he asks if there is another way to use his hair as a weapon. The goddess, at first, seems unconcerned, but then she explains that they do not explode that quickly. He asks her to inform him right away. Then, in the background, we see an explosion happening. Meanwhile, we return to the scene where we find the protagonist arriving. As he arrives, we see a villager calling out for him. They ask him to come over, and when he does, he sees a crowd of people. Seeing all those people, he realizes that everyone looks happy. They then notice that the weapons they had ordered earlier have just arrived. On the ground, we see various weapons available for them to use for their defense. Surprised by this, they ask if that is all that arrived. The villager confirms that it is. We are also introduced to the merchant, Bazio. At that moment, Bazio asks where the new village chief is. Hajime Sakamoto extends his hand and says it is a pleasure to meet him. However, Bazio simply looks at his palm, confused. Only afterward does he recognize our protagonist. After that, he reveals that this guy looked more like a wanderer. Our hero tries to explain, but Basio ignores him because he doesn't care about such things. What matters most to him is whether or not he will be paid. Everything was going well with the trade. On the other hand, the protagonist says he is fine with everything since all the requested weapons are there. But upon taking a closer look at the weapons, he notices that their quality is somewhat lower than expected. The villager is surprised by this. To this, the merchant explains that the number of weapons he brought was massive, and the amount of iron used was considerable. Looking back, the villager is astonished because this is the first time he has seen such a large quantity of weapons. However, Hajime, judging by the merchant's reaction, feels that something about the market rates doesn't seem wrong. Then why does his attitude seem so bad? He wonders what is really going on. The merchant turns to the protagonist and asks what is happening. Then he begins to say that if they are not satisfied, he can simply take the weapons back and leave. At the same time, he explains that he went out of his way to come all the way to this remote village, and the loss of profit for him is quite high. In the end, he realizes that a one-time transaction offers very little profit. For him, this business deal was a total failure. He continues to say that people living in remote areas do not understand business. After all, a constant flow of smaller transactions over time is worth more than a single big trade. But his reason for coming here was precisely this. He continues to think that, after all the expenses for traveling, fighting monsters, and labor costs, it was extremely costly. The villagers ask if it was really worth it. For them, there is no issue at all since he can come whenever he wants. Plus, what he offered was a unique opportunity to buy high-quality resources exclusively from him. Our protagonist starts thinking. After pondering for a while, we see him turn to the villager and ask if they know other merchants. By doing this, our protagonist practically ignores this merchant. So, he goes off looking for other merchants. However, Basio tells him that it is pointless to look for others because the situation will be the same. At that moment, he extends his hand and offers him something. It is a set of rare pearls, leaving this guy completely speechless. And after that, he says that this is today's part. The villager extends his hand, but the merchant ends up opening his mouth and asks, "Today's part?" We see our protagonist commenting that it was meant to be used as a guarantee for supplies or food, since in case he had to prepare for a war, they would have food, weapons, and everything necessary for their supply. At this moment, Aeon turns to the other side, but he asks them not to worry. He is holding these pearls, and if he loses them, it's not a problem because he could collect as many of these valuable pearls as he wanted. This again leaves the merchant completely speechless, but after being stunned. After that, with the true face of a merchant, he closes his hand. Only then does he start talking, saying that if it's food he is looking for, he doesn't need to worry because he is a merchant who sells that too. But once again, our protagonist wonders, even though he is someone who lives in the depths of misery, if he would sell to him. For that, the merchant says that he doesn't need to worry about such a thing. Again, upon hearing this, our protagonist approaches him. Only now that he has gotten closer does he say that, at first, he didn't think of them as a weak village. How could they be offering such valuable pearls to him? So at the beginning, he underestimated them. But setting that aside, our protagonist asks how much he wants to negotiate in this transaction. Of course, he basically needs to receive a competitive budget from other merchants as well, since that is the main business of traders. For this, he turns to the villager and asks if he happens to know another vendor. The villager replies that he knows a guy named Kimon. Before he could finish speaking, our protagonist asks him to call this guy since he wants to talk to him. After saying he was going to call the new merchant, we see him summoning him for our protagonist. Our hero approaches him, and as soon as he does, he asks him to give an estimate of how much he would be spending. But it seems that the man remains silent. That means he doesn't want anything. But judging from his reaction, even without an estimate, he and his group wouldn't be in trouble, leaving the villager completely shaken. He even looks sad. And so, later in the afternoon, he ends up withdrawing with his carriage. From the background, our protagonist thanks him for the weapons. Now that he has left, the goddess is surprised to see that our protagonist refuted that merchant quite a bit. But in any case, The merchant who has now left was quite surprised by our protagonist's life. However, even if he underestimates his remote village, our protagonist has plenty of resources to prove people like that merchant wrong. Yet, for him, there was no need to show off. The goddess noticed that, in that dispute to see who had more financial power, that merchant ended up losing. After all, he lost our protagonist as a great client. But the fight for independence was approaching, and in that life, at that moment, there were many happy people, while others were preparing to fight, and some were just waiting for their end. He also couldn't just trust people like those merchants over there. But our scene cuts to another location. Another day, we see our protagonist approaching an abandoned house, and as he gets closer, he wonders if this is the chief's house. Looking at the side of the house, he thinks it might be, so he ends up kind of entering inside. He even thinks that he shouldn't be an intruder, but as soon as he steps in, he is in for a big surprise. Inside, it looks like a ritual is taking place. At this moment, the goddess behind him starts mocking him. However, our protagonist realizes that he will have to live in this house filled with these summoning things. At the same time, he cannot back down because the villagers asked him to be their leader. But now that he is here, he needs to remodel this house, removing some things that won't be of much use to him. As he talks about this, he grabs the items inside the house and starts throwing them out the window. At the same time, the goddess asks if she could help our protagonist, which surprises him a lot. But she reveals that the reason is that she will also be living in this house for a long time. After talking for a bit, our protagonist thanks her for her help. But the goddess, who was just observing, suddenly snaps her fingers. At that moment, when she snaps them, an old TV appears, and from the ceiling, a light shines down, remodeling everything and transforming a room that previously had no technology into a fully technological one. Looking at the room, our hero is quite surprised. But he also wonders why there is a TV here. The goddess says that to remodel this room, she needed to take a look at the protagonist only managed to reach this point this way. However, our protagonist, in the end, only gets it right. But the goddess of jumping ends up saying that the TV ends up working in the end, which surprises him even more. For this, he snaps his fingers back there, and she ends up showing him what she wanted. Then, Vin, stunned, ends up turning it on only to later show our protagonist. At first, he thought something from a program would appear, but in the end, it was he who appeared there. However, the goddess says that, at the moment, it is more interesting and fun to watch our protagonist. But still dissatisfied with what just appeared on the TV, she snaps her fingers again, and there appears our hero, except now a bit squared. Ignoring all that was happening, he lies on the floor and notices that the tatami on the ground was perfect. He never thought he would find a perfect tatami in another world, one like in a Japanese kitchen. But except for the TV that was there, all the items around seemed somewhat ordinary to her. But now that he stopped to think, he might be reconstructing these houses in other locations. After all, in this world, the same materials exist as in his own. However, he must leave this as a priority for later, as now he needs to deal with the new merchant. At the moment, he needs to prepare everything so that the kimono can arrive here. But for now, he should focus on the most crucial points. In this case, it is crucial to understand what should be avoided at all costs. He even gives it a name, something like Final Line. But the goddess, on the other hand, realizes that the idea he had wasn't that great, mainly because the merchants he was looking for only had low-level items. However, he said that it wasn't so bad, since, whether he liked it or not, low-level items were already sufficient. But for that, he would first need to take those weapons and test them on the monsters around to at least check their resistance. The worst case, though, was if everything went wrong, they might cancel the deal they had in the middle of the process. On the other hand, she just thinks that he was trying to become a slave to a corporation again. But then, he begins to explain something to her. A classic black company tactic. They advertise an annual income of 1 million yen, or even a monthly income of 500,000 yen. But all that money, once you join the company, ends up turning into some commissions, or just a few specific people end up earning that much money. And then, after they attract you, it becomes almost impossible to leave on your own. So, It's difficult, and it would be a huge problem to be cut off after being drawn in. So he begins explaining that if they started an agreement now, but, in the end, decided to cut ties and suddenly increase the terms in the middle of a war, they would have a huge problem. Therefore, it was almost mandatory to maintain a stable and long-lasting contract. While thinking about strategies, someone appears at the door. That person called out to R. But the moment he opens the door and sees everything inside, he is completely surprised. He simply says that he ended up renovating and transforming the place into a more habitable space. He understands that, but at this moment, our protagonist has a doubt. So he asks the villager if, by any chance, the former lord and the leader of this village had a contract with someone else. Then he asks if there's any way to tell what kind of magical contract was made. For that, they reveal that the contract was made using some magic, but it requires a very high-quality magic. Our hero doesn't understand very well, but it seems to be a magic that enforces the contract, which is something very interesting for him and his future. At that moment, he turns to him and asks if he knows about this contract or has any details about it. But the villager ends up saying no, as the one who did all that was the chief. But then they ask, where could that contract have been left behind? Aldeon ends up revealing that the chief didn't have a specific place to store important things. That means the contract he previously made might be hidden somewhere in this room. While thinking about where it could be, he looks at the goddess. She then stares back at our protagonist and realizes that he wanted her to reverse everything. After that, she ends up reversing it. Now that everything has been reversed, Sir Damin asks him what the previous village chief held in such high regard. In response, he reveals that it was a strange skull. Then, he starts looking at the shelves but doesn't find anything. Not finding it, he stops to think about where he could have thrown it. Away. Only then does he remember that, while cleaning the house, he had thrown one of those skulls outside. He then leaves the house and starts rummaging through the trash. There he ends up finding that thing. But on that skull, there was a crack, which very likely meant that the item he was looking for was inside. Using his hands, he grips the skull tightly and with all his strength pulls it upward. As soon as he pulls, he finally extracts the item. After pulling it out, he sees a slightly purple smoke rising, and then something mysterious appears, greatly startling our protagonist. At that moment, he wonders what that thing was. The entity swiftly flies in his direction, but before it can grab him, he forces one of his high destruction spells into the palm of his hand. As soon as it forms, that thing flies toward the energy that has just appeared. The impact sends the monster soaring into the sky, being hurled in an unknown direction. The entire village witnesses this, and purely by reflex, our protagonist does something he shouldn't have, leaving Aldeon completely speechless. In the end, all that remains is the trail of destruction left by his power. His power was quite potent because, looking to the side, Aldeon ends up calling out to our protagonist. The reason? Our hero had accidentally hit part of the merchant's cart. Only after seeing all of this does he remember the real reason Aldeon had entered his house in the first place. But now that Kimon has just arrived, he approaches and asks if he is okay. He simply replies that he is fine. As they continue talking, we then see the merchant approaching our protagonist. As he comes closer, he introduces himself. His name is Kimon Seon. With the merchant's arrival, our protagonist can finally move forward with his mission. The moment the merchant introduces himself, our protagonist follows suit, introducing himself as Hajime. Now that they are here, he invites Hajime to a quieter place to discuss their plans. He then turns to Daeon and asks if there is a calmer area for this. Daeon then says that the potato field is the quietest place where someone can stay. Besides, today was not a harvest day, so they could stay there peacefully. As they reach the spot, we see our protagonist thanking him for his presence. However, he asks not to be thanked too much since this is his first time acting as a negotiator. Moreover, he comments that this place might not be the most suitable for discussion, but Hajime tells him not to worry, as there was no one around to overhear them here. Besides, it was impossible to eavesdrop. After all, in his previous world, he had picked up some tips that important figures often held crucial discussions on golf courses. If they went somewhere enclosed, they would most likely be overheard, or even have spies lurking nearby. That was simply out of the question, But on a golf course, the chance of having people around was practically zero. Hearing this, he is surprised, as he had never thought of holding such a meeting in an open field. Ignoring all that, the merchant comments that our protagonist ended up defeating a rather powerful beast in his territory. He wasn't just strong, but also very cunning. Additionally, he wonders what exactly a terrestrial beast meant. It was likely that he didn't know, but it referred to the monsters that people in this territory called by that name. However, since our protagonist was also unfamiliar with such terms, he simply assumes that the merchant is talking about that giant monster that had swallowed him. The merchant confirms this. Terrestrial beast is not an official term, but it comes from the fact that their massive size makes them resemble the Earth itself. They are a type of environmental monster, similar in concept. Since hunting a monster like that is extremely dangerous, most people avoid taking such a risk. Thus, in 100% of the cases, the lords of these territories end up abandoning the idea of fighting such monsters. It is highly likely that the previous lord of this village made the same decision. Since he became a sacrifice, he understands very well what that means. The villagers here are very fortunate to be free from that terrestrial beast. But looking closely at him now, it seems impossible for a village of this size to be secure. So the merchant asks how Hajime managed such an incredible feat of slaying that monster. Hajime avoids answering. He also dodges the question because at this moment he wants to focus more on his trade. Our hero is buying some good items from him. Additionally, he heard that our protagonist would be paying him with those magical spheres. Quite rare in the world, and for that, he ends up saying yes. Moreover, he has an ability that allows him to find this type of sphere, which leaves our merchant completely surprised. After all, an ability like this is extremely rare. Additionally, if he manages to maintain the quality of the resources he provides to the merchant will, in turn, provide him with top-quality resources as well. But in the end, it seems that he only wanted gold. However, he realizes that maintaining a contract with this guy will be a bit difficult. He even mentions that as things stand now, keeping a contract with our protagonist would be too risky. Furthermore, he knows that this village intends to gain its independence from the Lord. If he succeeds, that would be good, but he begins asking our protagonist what his plans are to achieve independence. After all, at the beginning, he will need his own strength to defend and protect the village. That was quite understandable and at times could even seem harsh. But without the Lord's support, maintaining a defense force and fully armed guards ready for a fight all by himself was entirely impossible. To make matters worse, the village was extremely small, and he ends up understanding the situation. This means he will need permanent and separate forces capable of defending against strong enemies, as relying on bandits would be impossible. However, at least in the short to medium term, establishing a basic level of defense could be manageable. But to achieve that, he will need to manage these people. He might need about an entire semester to do so. But how will he maintain the troops and guards? What will he do for that? He then raises his hand, holding that magical sphere, and says that he found it today. As he mentioned earlier, he can acquire this type of thing very easily, without any problems. The issue of resources and finances for the village has already been resolved. Now, he needs the merchant to hire some guards or mercenaries so that he can ensure more security for the village. Moreover, there are things in the village that will not require external forces. However, he ends up being interrupted by the merchant, as what he was imagining about our hero was exactly that. At first, he thought our hero was crazy, but not only did he choose a somewhat isolated place for their discussion, he also considered the mercenary option. His perception of defense was remarkable, and our protagonist takes it as quite a compliment. But there is a problem. But to be a good merchant, he ends up offering his help so that our hero can find some good mercenaries. He even wonders if he can do that, but for him at the moment it was almost impossible to be doing this on his behalf as well. Although some mercenaries may seem similar to markers, most of them have different values. Many do not like merchants acting as if they were an intermediary. So knowing this, he asks that he at least give him 1 or 2 pieces of information about some mercenaries. But before he can go through with it, he will only need to verify some information. But there is one thing he likes to comment on. He always likes to be involved in these life-or-death businesses, something that he says makes our protagonist a little happy. However, he interrupts everything because he wanted to be selling some information, and also, in addition to selling information, he would also like to work with him for a long term, for a long period of time. But he also asks if he has any advice that he can be putting in his village. Leaving him confused, he then asks why he wants to know these answers. He says that he doesn't want to depend too much on other people's resources, because if they depend on too many people, their village will collapse sooner or later. So, as soon as possible, they need to achieve independence, so that things will be a little easier for them. Then he starts to say that if they basically want to become independent, the village needs to build a stable that can basically move a fairly self-sustaining economy. That can also maintain a relationship with the merchants, yes, with those pearls, the ones he finds. But it was necessary to do some things that leave him confused. He continues to say that, to be honest, he wanted to maintain a long-term relationship with our protagonist, since he sees a pretty incredible future in our protagonist. But to do something like that, it was necessary to see and understand some current situations, and in the end, our protagonist understands himself. But with his ability to find those magic pearls, he will only need one more thing. He thinks that everything he did there ended up getting to this point where he is. So he turns back and finds the goddess, which means that now he has the luck and that ability of hers to find those pearls. Having the goddess of blessing by his side, he assumes that he will be getting everything he wants, but before he can leave, he would like to ask him something, which confuses him. He then comments there that in this place there was a guardian beast, who lived there for a while, mysteriously disappeared for a few days, and the moment he talks about it, he ends up remembering the beating he gave that monster. But when one of these guardians disappears for whatever reason, the creatures that it was suppressing then begin to behave in a much more different way. Our protagonist then thinks of one thing, and only later he remembers something, that the people of this village, I am also beginning to show some signs of this same behavior. And in fact, when humans are basically freed from the presence of a guardian beast, their way of life also changes a lot, but at least with humans they can negotiate, ignoring the smaller creatures as well. But the problems are really with those ferocious monsters and wild beasts. Something that our protagonist still didn't know, but he continues to say that it's something they should deal with a little faster, by eliminating these monsters, since these monsters will be attacking humans anyway. He will basically see humans as food. And only after he says this, he ends up understanding and then ends up kind of remembering something in the past. It was like they were bullies who had just entered a new school, so he ends up asking them to behave and try to solve this situation in a simpler way. Since after the death of the guardian beast, he wants our protagonist to investigate any type of animals or monsters that were there that could attack any human. And also, it is possible that he disappears at any time, not only in this place, but also in other places. Cities nearby here too. This is a critical request that basically has to be done, because he needs to have a good and important relationship with Chemo, and this is something that he will be completing, and he will be eliminating all these monsters as quickly as possible. And before he can leave, he asks our protagonist for something new, even though it is a pretty boring job. He asks him to become the chief of this village here, leaving our protagonist completely open-mouthed, because the real reason he is here, not even for others, is for other people, and not even for that accident with that rich old man there, in itself for the protagonist. The guy, he saw potential in him from afar. He has also known this village for a long time, and to sum it up here, he doesn't see any value in having investment in this village without the protagonist here. And he understands why he is here. The real reason was our protagonist. After saying this, that he is considered an important person, she disappears. Also saying the same thing, that she is only here because of him, and besides, there's nothing else to do. Since she's already here, he needs to move on, and he can't get nervous just because he was valued by a mere merchant. So she just asks him to see if things are a little different, For the last time, she asks him to become a good chief of this village and treat the villagers in a more specific way. And so, he leaves, and our protagonist only returns to the village. Right at the entrance, there was that villager from before who said that he will support our protagonist no matter what. Not only him, but also the rest of the people in the village, since if Hajime is leading him, they will most certainly be following our protagonist everywhere. Even the goddess ends up saying that it seems that he wasn't the only one who thought that way. But before he can continue, he turns to the villager and starts asking if this is what they wanted. If not, if there isn't even one person who would be against our protagonist. But to tell the truth, he said no, because our protagonist was a guy who defended the village with all his might. Then he went on to say that it was about making sure that everyone in the village could basically support themselves. And then again, he asks if it would be okay if he were to become the leader of the village. And at this point, when he talks about it, everyone shouts, yes. The villagers and those people behind the scenes, everyone ends up agreeing, and as soon as it was agreed, our protagonist ends up smiling with happiness. After a while, we cut away from the village, but before anything can start in the village, our protagonist comments that he will need to walk closer to the village to be able to do some searching around to find maybe dangerous monsters, to make sure that everyone comes back alive and safe. Our protagonist goes along, and so the scene cuts to him in the middle of the forest, walking. Walking through the middle of the forest, he finds nothing, but after walking a little more, they end up finding a tree that had some tears. And only after that tear, we find a boar that jumped in front of our hero. But with a simple movement, he manages to suck that boar. After knocking it down, we then cut to the village where the merchant has just returned. He returned with the war equipment. To dress up as monsters, our protagonist holds the boar, giving the population the will to fight against them. But it still wasn't enough. So they fight against some of the mutant snakes. The fight was good, but in the middle of it, one of those mutant spiders appeared. And at this moment, our protagonist fights against it and only then manages to knock it down. He also finds that magic pearl there. And at this point, they end up tying together all the hunts they did in that period of time. He eliminated the monsters without worrying, and the place where the monsters were found are also listed there on the list, which makes the merchant totally happy, and even leaves him quite surprised to see that our protagonist not only managed to give information about the monsters, but also fought and marked the specific place where he cannot pass. But our protagonist then asks him, what did he think? However, the merchant ends up wondering if in that fight there, he basically had the help of the villagers, since when looking at the marks of the monsters there on the skin, it seems that he did have help from the villagers. Before he can continue, our protagonist remembers that he basically has some knowledge about these villagers, and as said before, without our protagonist, he doesn't even see enough value to be investing in this village. So, to really gain value for other merchants, he will have to make this village gain a little more value. So again, our protagonist asks if they could possibly continue with those merchant friendships, since even if they become partners, he cannot guarantee that he will be around to be able to deal with all of this. Then he comments that everything should be guaranteed that all of this can be managed without him. When he then looks at the villagers, he notices the gigantic changes, and it seems that joining our protagonist will be a gigantic advantage. But at the moment he will need to review his assessments a little more, especially because the villagers of the village seem to have gigantic potential, and he finally extends his hand and ends up commenting that it will be a pleasure to be working with our protagonist. Our protagonist says the same thing, and here he will be by his side and will be able to achieve many things. But before everything can begin, he has a new task for our protagonist, since to be investing in this village. So, to really gain value for other merchants, he will have to make this village gain a little more value. So, again, our protagonist asks if they could possibly continue with those merchant friendships, since even if they become partners, he cannot guarantee that he will be around to be able to deal with all of this. Then he comments that everything should be guaranteed that all of this can be managed without him. When he then looks at the villagers, he notices the gigantic changes, and it seems that joining our protagonist will be a gigantic advantage. But at the moment, he will need to review his assessments a little more, especially because the villagers of the village seem to have gigantic potential, and he finally extends his hand and ends up commenting that it will be a pleasure to be working with our protagonist. Our protagonist says the same thing, and here he will be by his side and will be able to achieve many things. But before everything can begin, he has a new task for our protagonist, since he has just become the leader of this village. He would like all the villagers to enjoy some of the rewards of this task, since instead of trading this time, he wants to be making the payment. And when he talks about the payment, our protagonist understands it well, but the villagers, on the other hand, understand it differently, that now he will have basically a fairly stable future. Which leaves our protagonist on the other side completely surprised, because he was taken by surprise to see that his people liked the proposal given by the merchant so much. But before everything can move forward, he must be reviewing some details of this advantage, of these advantages. Everyone who was there ends up stopping to listen to what he was saying. Then he starts to say that this is the extraordinary fur of an animal called a fury. It is a popular product also well known for its durability and warmth. So does that mean that if the villagers of the village process the fur, he can be buying it? He extends his hand and says that he will buy it. He also guarantees that he will buy it from them if by chance the skin is processed, and so the people of the village again hear this and go crazy again. The protagonist understands that everyone was happy, even though they have not yet basically planned the price that they will be charging for those skins that they will be refining, but having another income for them is quite different. Even because they live off agriculture, having another income of money is extremely rare, and for them it is pure happiness. The protagonist is, on the other hand, for a little. Then he comments there that by obtaining the harvest from agriculture, from hunting, you can be surviving, but these goods can be spoiled over time and as well as losing value depending on their demand. And to make matters worse, they are difficult to store as an asset. But in the case of money, it does not spoil and can maintain its value for a long period of time. For them, accumulating wealth may be becoming an easy thing. This makes our protagonist happy, especially because they were happy too, since if he accepts the proposal, they will have a new stable income to have a very peaceful life. So knowing that they can earn more and more money, he takes this seriously. The scene cuts to another location. The hunting group ends up leaving. They end up finding another animal. Finding the animal, they end up shooting the arrow, hitting its head. As soon as they bring it down, they end up skinning it, taking off the skin. He realizes that it is much easier to remove the skin from smaller animals, and this may also be enough for the children to help them, since it is a very easy thing for them to do, so they can be doing it too. After a while, they end up taking the skin and putting it in the sun to dry. After a while, the population is happy with the results. The protagonist is also more than happy. However, after a while, another merchant appears and goes towards our protagonist. He calls out to him, "Sakamoto," and he ends up introducing himself as this guy. After introducing himself, he introduces himself as a merchant, and Kimon, his friend, was talking about our protagonist a lot. And what's more, he came all the way here from far away to buy the furs that Kimon ended up saying he has here in this village. Knowing this, our protagonist is already happy, but the ones who are happier are the villagers, who end up leaving to get the furs. Now that he's here, he found out why he was speaking so highly of our protagonist. He even commented that our protagonist seemed to be a special case, since it was also rare for a market or a merchant like that to travel a long distance to come to this village, because normally they go to the place where they stay to bring goods for them. And in the end, our hero understands, because normally I haven't seen people who are merchants here. Because there's an expense with the animals, there are also expenses that can simply happen along the way, or there are also thefts of materials. The Fury skin wasn't basically a good thing, since it was famous. Since it was famous among ordinary people who go there and see it and buy it right away, so the profit in the end isn't that much. So Kimon usually ends up selling those high-quality skins to rich customers. So it's no surprise that they're dealing with this kind of Fury skin now, but really, managing to get one of the most important merchants to go far to look for our protagonist. The thing was meaning that it was too rare, but for him, he sees it with intense eyes, or it means that the person wants too humble. So he ends up approaching our hero and ends up asking for some advice from him. While commenting on this, that old man from before who listens to everything appears. He comments that he heard a lot of praise from our protagonist's Mr. Keeman, so he asks again for him to teach him some wisdom. But the villager reappears and only comments that Mr. Keeman was really that high-quality person. He even praises our protagonist, and to make it even better, he ends up telling this guy that he was the one who brought Mr. Keeman to this village, and everyone listening to this then starts to grow an ego of happiness. But they are quickly ignored, as they both start to get into the mood, dance, and be happy. However, hours later, they arrive with the skins and begin the delivery to the merchant. After a while, the goddess appears and comments that those young men seem to be too sincere, something that our protagonist understands as if he were an ordinary person. He looked like a villager, and what's more, he seems to like what he's doing. The only difference is that his ambition overflows too much, and it seems like he wants to be valued by Mr. Kaiman, who seems like those people in every company who think they're superior to any other person. To make matters worse, it seems like he wants to think he's much more than you, but too soon. For him, this is too naive, because in his mind he even ends up thinking that he could be showing his superior what he could be doing better than him. They end up rushing too much, and reality ends up hitting them too hard, and this ends up discouraging them. After all, he considers these types of people like that, perhaps too sincere. However, compared to him and our protagonist, there was a huge difference, because he would be in the legendary classification, and he is still only at a normal rarity level, or just a high normal. But after a while there, the sales end up being finalized. He then thanks the elder, and only then leaves with his cart. Everyone in the village thanks him for coming here to buy the business. After he buys it, we then see the amount of money on the table. Everyone in the village is surprised by this, because they finally got another way to get money without having to work in the fields. Now that he has earned the money, the villager approaches our protagonist, extends his hand, giving our protagonist his share. But for him, he understands it as an attribute for his work. And then he ends up kind of understanding that he should be grateful for this, so he puts his hand in front of him. Only later does he end up saying that he didn't need it. The money was theirs. They end up wondering if they really didn't want to take the money, because our protagonist even asks if they have plans to use that money, since the income from the money is unlimited. So they shouldn't worry about a small part of it for our protagonist. And anyway, he asks him to keep it. They could use that money for whatever they wanted. However, they end up thinking that they should really give it to our protagonist, because whether they like it or not, he is the chief of the village, and our protagonist only thinks that the guys, they should be staying as the chief of the village alone. Knowing that he can't be accepting the money, they end up thinking about giving it, leaving behind some food, and in the end, he couldn't be refusing it. So the next day, they end up bringing a good amount of food and leaving it by the door. Our protagonist is even surprised by this. The villagers all end up kind of reaching out and telling him to accept that food there. Looking at it now, he realizes that it would last. It would last for more than maybe a year. But now he stops and starts looking at those boxes full of rice, and at that moment, he notices some fungi. Looking at it now, he realizes that it doesn't seem to be in the best conditions. He comments that yes, they tried everything to protect it from rats, but these little guys come from any kind of place and end up gnawing on some parts of the barrel, so he thinks of a method to keep these animals away and also keep the fungus away a little. That was to build a construction, and for him, that was the best method to have a safe storage. They shouldn't give up the war against these animals for now, so he should be building a very safe warehouse to be able to keep those rats and some mold from taking the food. So after a few days or hours, that construction is finished. He comments that it was exactly what he asked for. The villagers approach our hero, and he ends up wondering about the shape of it, why it seems so strange. And for this he explains that this was called a multi-story warehouse in his other world, and that its shape has several reasons. But the main one is that it reduces the risk of being damaged by the floor, and it was also designed this way to resist humidity and prevent food from being ruined by any type of mold, leaving everyone in the village completely surprised. But when you look at it now, you realize what this meant. And for this, he ends up explaining that this meant a type of protector against rats. The rats tend to climb up there, but they wouldn't be able to. The rats try to climb up, but they can't. But there are other ways and advantages too, and he even offers anyone in the village to take this type of project that he made and build it on the same base as, in the same house as them, as this will prevent rats or any type of thing. But to build it, he will need money. So for this, he will be covering the entire construction with those animal skins that he will be selling here. But making the boss pay for all this would be a bit much, but our protagonist said that it was fine, he would take care of it all, and since it was the boss who wanted this anyway, he will obey, they will just move on. But before he can leave, there is only one favor for them to do. So they obey, he just needs to tell them what they need to do. Looking at them now, they seem fine. They seem to be quite happy, something that this goddess on the side here doesn't understand very well, since she ends up commenting that she is basically not a type of existence that is widely recognized by the public, unlike the gods, the common spirits, and she is not worshipped by anyone or known for receiving prayers from people, something that our protagonist is a little surprised by. So he turns to her and asks if she would like to try that. Looking at her now, she said that it wouldn't be such a bad thing to be experiencing, although honestly, she doesn't like being exposed to the public like this. But with each word she said there, she got more and more tangled up. She asks to change the subject. Our protagonist then enters her warehouse. As she went up, she commented there before that our protagonist commented that, in this warehouse that he built, there were other types of advantages. One of these advantages was the ladder. The goddess, on the other hand, asks for it to be removed, because they could, to be jumping, but our hero even understands that it would be cool. But no human could jump that high, and not even others can fly. And for a human to be able to put this here all the time, and take it off all the time, it would be a pain. But also, while commenting on this, they end up remembering that lord. It is very likely that that lord will not be retreating silently. He will probably be making some kind of movement in movement soon, creating traps, or maybe putting up a sign saying that this place belongs to him. But the chance of being fighting face to face with that guy was extremely low. But that guy is that kind of sneaky that, for example, he could be doing anything like a rock rolling on top of our protagonist. But he could be claiming that it was an accident. But if he survived, he could accidentally be facing a gigantic amount of monster horde. But if something here accidentally caused basically ruin him, technically that would not violate that contract he has. Well, it's very likely that he's the kind of person who exploits loopholes a lot and invents some dirty tricks, but he would say that there's a 50-50% chance that he'll be able to win or he'll lose. Meanwhile, out of nowhere, they start to change the subject. These subjects were about the past. It was about our protagonist's past, about some embarrassing things that she started reading, however. He ends up saying the saying that it's better to basically forget what happened in the past. The important thing is the future. But then out of nowhere, that villager appears and comments on that thing that our protagonist already asked for. They have a slightly cruder version of this. He just asks for him to go to a certain place so that he can see the result. Since it was the request, they will obey, especially because some artisans are quite excited about it. So then it cuts to another place. The people of the village end up sweating. The people of the village were in front of a house, and our protagonist ends up arriving, and there our protagonist finally sees the thing he wanted so much. That statue of that goddess who has been following our protagonist for a long time. She looks at it and is surprised and even realizes that it was her. The artisan asks how it was. He says it was great, especially because it has a gigantic similarity to the deity there. But the villager approaches and wonders what this deity would be like. So to that, our protagonist turns to the side and comments on what was interesting about it. Leaving her a little shy, however, the villagers, on the other hand, end up being happy with the result of what he just said. Until just now, she was focused on watching her past, but she didn't even notice what our protagonist was working on until now. It even seems like he managed to surprise her. And as he said just now, those who inhabit the past always end up getting lost. And she ends up understanding about that. And right after he said that the future is the best thing to catch, our protagonist lets a smile slip there. But he ends up saying something there to the craftsman, so that he should continue with that craftsmanship he was building there. But he needed to be as careful as possible, because this statue he will be building was the image of the deity that was protecting this village, and the goddess, on the other hand, ends up chipping the other smile, and now he is happy about it. Well, in the end, he managed to surprise her a lot, and if by chance the thing he is building turns into something basically fun, she starts thinking about what she could be doing for him. However, while she was thinking about this, the scene changes to a mansion. And in this mansion, we find that buck-toothed guy from before. He thinks he can find some ways to get revenge on our protagonist, but he knew he wouldn't be able to. But by accident, maybe an accident could happen to our protagonist. And today, we will continue with our Hajime. The other day, there, he was delighted with the size of the spear now. But he was delighted because they used quite an interesting material. This was a cache, it was strong and flexible, and then he said that the material was selected first, and so it was used in this spear, and it was also carefully selected specifically for them. He then even said that what he did was quite simple. He just did the basics and chose the best items for the best client, like our protagonist. For him, business is just business. After all, you can rest assured. And also, as expected of Kimon, he really was that person who was to be admired. However, he still looks for some tips so that he can be getting closer and closer to have that recognition from Kimon. Next time, he even thinks about saying this, but hey, he doesn't have time to stay here anymore. He gets on his wagon and ends up leaving. The moment he leaves the materials behind. And so the villagers all approach it. They try to look for a sword or something else and end up wondering why it doesn't have it. He reveals that he only took spears. Others are sad because they wanted to have some swords in their hands. He apologizes, which makes them, the whole village, a little sad about what he just did. While they were feeling sad about this, the goddess appears. She wonders why he just chose spears instead of swords. Something that makes our protagonist even wonder if, by chance, she didn't look into his mind to discover the truth. She says no, because that would ruin the surprise. So he ends up trying to summarize it as much as possible. He reveals that it was the cost. He even checked out of concern, iron was very expensive after all. With the amount of iron needed to make a sword, he would only make 5 or 6, but with the spearhead he would make more. However, there are hets, which basically don't cost much, but they are also very good. And by choosing this cheaper item, you can make a lot more equipment for everyone. But now, what was the second reason? He asks them to wait a little. He then calls everyone and wants to explain a few things to him. First, they need to be hunting in 5 people. So he asks them to take some hets with blunt spears and line up. And they could participate in any form. It could be young people, children or women, anything. And as soon as everyone gets close, they take them. And so he wants to see how flexible it would be to use this spear. It was simple, just take it and swing it. So the boys come closer and take one of the spears. With the length of the spear, you can create a natural curve through which you can generate significantly high power on your opponent. And most importantly, using little force. Looking back now, they realized that the movement was good. However, the movements looked more like those they did in agriculture. Showing what was to be done, he turns to the rest of the village people. And so, he ends up wondering if, by chance, there is someone who wants to test his skills. So far, there was no one. Most of them were afraid or didn't want to get into a war. However, this one appears, and he was curious, so he wanted to try, especially because in this village, he was considered the toughest guy in the village. This will be a piece of cake for him. And there's also no way he can lose at anything, especially because he works a lot on the farm and manages to carry a lot of heavy things, which makes him extremely strong. However, he starts running towards the weaker villagers. But the moment he gets closer, we see him swinging those stakes that fall on top of him. He, who was the strongest, was easily knocked down by them. On the ground, he cut himself, he hurt himself. So he wondered where he got his weapon that was so strong. But now, he wants to know the result. So he turns to the people of the village, and comments that people, anyone there, can be fighting a monster. And if you add a sharp thing to the tip of the spear, they can basically become a stronger army, because they could easily take down any kind of monster. Imagine 50 people or 10 people using this. Or also, they could even stand their ground, fighting against a trained and strong gentleman. But even though he looks at them now, he realizes that perhaps his opponents, the villagers, are afraid. That was normal, but they could be using movements that were more familiar, like agriculture. They could be using the movements they make to plant or to harvest. So while he was thinking about this, we see our protagonist agreeing with everything she said. At the same time, then, we see something happening behind us. In the woods in the distance, we hear a noise. This catches our protagonist's attention, and the moment he turns around, he ends up coming face to face with a spider, which ends up kind of surprising our protagonist. Everyone, upon seeing that spider, gets scared. And only then, our protagonist asks everyone to calm down. And now was the specific and perfect moment to use the spear. They then take the spear and place it in front, waiting for the spider to come towards them. They didn't need to be afraid, they just had to synchronize. So he just asks them to apply a little force and throw it down a little. That's what they do. They raise the spear, and only after it's raised, the spider starts running towards them. But before it can get close, he shouts for them to lower it. And the moment he shouts, they lower that spear as fast as they can. But by lowering it like that, they manage to make some small scratches, but it still wasn't enough to knock down the spider. So they raise the spear again, and only after it's raised, they lower it. And the moment it's lowered, they scratch the spider a little more. It still wasn't enough. So he asked them to do it again. And so they do. After a long time, we find the villager. We find this person totally exhausted, while others are staring. On the ground, we find the spider completely knocked down. On the other hand, our protagonist realizes that this was too perfect. And in the end, they managed to defeat it. Everyone thinks this is incredible. The villagers behind just celebrate. Meanwhile, the protagonist nods and is happy about everything. But while they were celebrating this, our protagonist starts thinking about something else, that their farming really made them strong. But now, thinking about it, the impulses they used before were enough to knock down the spider, which means they can deal with monsters. They just needed to get used to it. And to do that, then, he now needed to do one thing: train them so they could fight easier monsters. However, the villagers, on the other hand, hearing this, only end up agreeing. They raise their swords, while the goddess, on the other hand, ends up feeling the presence of some things. Finally, our protagonist also feels the presence of this. So he turns in another direction and finds a spider heading towards him. They wonder why there were others. However, here other villagers appear, asking him to let them try to finish off these monsters. However, not just one, but two appear. However, minutes later, others appear, like an army of spiders. These spiders, for some reason, were following a straight path towards our protagonist. And when they see all these spiders, the two of them, who were eager to fight, end up backing down. However, he, our protagonist, asks everyone to go back to the village. He wanted to solve this all by himself. Besides, he doesn't need to worry about our hero. He already cleaned out a spider nest by himself. And so, he turns around, and he understands that our protagonist will really succeed. Everyone ends up retreating to the village because our protagonist needed to be alone for a while. Now facing these spiders, he realizes that it will take some time to take them all down, but he will succeed. But now, looking at them a little closer, he realizes that they are a little bigger than normal. On the other hand, the goddess begins to think of a reason. Because for some reason, they came in such huge numbers. Maybe it was because they destroyed their nest. But these guys are basically moving in a line, in a group. This was not normal. So there must be some mastermind behind all this, or maybe manipulating them. and the moment she talks about it, she can see something there in the shadow behind some trees. And the moment she sees that shadow of a person, she comments to the protagonist that maybe he can't be wrong, since maybe there was a mind behind all of this. But there's one thing, he must be thinking about it later, but now he has to deal with them. So he advances towards them. One by one, he manages to take them down. In the end, he realizes that these monsters have a huge advantage. Stronger, these guys are not. However, after a long time of fighting, he finishes them off. Now that he's finished everything, he could be relaxing. Until the goddess points behind a tree there and comments that there is something. And the moment she points, that guy who was there realizes it too late, and our protagonist disappears, and only appears a few minutes later in front of him. He ends up getting scared. However, he doesn't even have time to react, because our protagonist managed to land a blow right in the middle of his belly. Only then does a red thing appear from his mouth. At that moment, he wonders where this guy came from. The goddess knew that this place was specific to her and was special. She was being worshipped for the first time, so she will use her power in their favor. And so she snaps her finger and wonders who he is. So he ends up revealing that he is from the Monster Tamer Guild and came on the orders of that lord. And then he thinks that that guy was really the one who did all this. But his goal is not even that. His goal was to eliminate those people who were a little troublesome. Then he realizes that the village is under attack, so he grabs the guy and wonders what he did. However, he ends up commenting that his role was just to stay here holding our protagonist, while his squad was attacking the village and destroying everything. But thinking about it, he thinks that he could not be forgiving that traitor. So he throws this guy, this extra, against this tree, and as he starts running towards the village, in the village itself, we find fire destroying everything, while those guards point there, asking them to kill everyone. But the children and the old people use their spears to defend themselves. The others are wounded on the ground. They then advance towards them. However, at this moment, when they are thinking about attacking, in the background we find our hero running towards them. After getting a little closer, he advances and manages to take them down one by one. And after taking them all down, they wonder where this guy came from and realize that the monster tamer also failed in his mission. Now that he is under control, he only asks the villagers to take their wounded away from here and take them to a safer place. Everyone ends up understanding this, and so they end up retreating. Now that the village chief has appeared, he ends up admitting that our protagonist really was a skilled guy. But there is no way he can defeat those 50 spiders in such a short time. Maybe he decided to run. Maybe those spiders were strong, and the tamer lost control of them. But he also heard about their abilities from the Lord. But it was a shame, since they were a team of assassins trained to hunt people like our protagonist. And he was chosen by the Lord. Each of them has enough skill to take down 100 of those spiders alone. And from now on, he will not be escaping from here anymore. However, the moment he says this, our protagonist simply disappears. Only then he appears below this extra. He prepares a punch that hits him. Close now, he wonders what he just said before. That it was over? After he falls to the ground, he wonders what he is doing now. He also dared to mess with his village. So he wonders if he is ready to pay for what they did. But then he asks his groups to attack and take him down. And the moment he asks, they advance. However, our protagonist with one blow takes down one, with another blow takes down another. And so, with a final blow, he takes down everyone, throwing them all up. The boss is then surprised he even opens his mouth. However, to end it once and for all, he advances towards it, especially because he was the final one and would have to be knocked down now. He prepares a punch and hits it right in the face. And only then was he thrown with all his force up into the sky, turning into a star. And if he really wants to destroy our protagonist's village, he'd better bring a guardian beast. That alone would perhaps be enough. After a while, he returns to a certain place, or rather, a hospital. There, they find everyone injured, but thanks to our protagonist, no one even died and no one was seriously injured. Also, thanks to that magic pearl of our protagonist's, Everyone in the village is much better healed. For him, he realizes that this was practically a miracle cure. It could cure any type of disease. And also, it's good that he trained some guards here so he could be protecting people while he was away for that minute. However, the boy in the background appears with the broken gun. He ends up kind of apologizing, especially because he used the gun to help protect the people in the village. But even so, they fought, but they couldn't defeat those strong people. However, this irritates our protagonist. However, he ends up just smiling and saying not to worry. After all, he could be buying other weapons. However, he didn't believe that that damned lord would attack even children. Our protagonist asks him to bring our protagonist a map that shows the location to that lord's mansion, which leaves everyone there wondering what our protagonist is doing. With a slightly more serious face, he comments that he will be destroying everything. After saying this, the next day, other weapons appear so that they could move forward. But he also appears, holding a map in his hand. This map guided him to the lord's castle. He takes the map and ends up opening it. But maps should basically be showing the location of the country, the city, and other things. But showing any small abandoned village doesn't mean much. However, he points in another direction and asks if, by chance, he can see that drawing of a castle. Then he answers that all this indicates that it is the location of the lord's property. And here, in total, there are 7 of them, and there are quite a few. And to this end, he ends up confirming that he has quite a lot of resistance on the property closest to this village as well. Looking back now, he realizes that the lord was basically not just preventing anything from happening in the village. He was simply there from afar, watching everything from the front row, the bad things happening in the village. And only then does he ask Kimon to go there and thank him. Also, he wanted to thank him personally for having brought this map. Minutes later, he appears in the village and ends up wondering if, by chance, he also didn't think quickly about wanting to get the map too, something that he also predicted. However, the scene changes to another location. In a very distant castle, we find our protagonist there in the back with the rest of the group. He realizes that the fortress had basically no one at the door. However, the gate is already extremely thick. It would withstand anything, so he could be making an attack right here. He raises his hand. Only then does he ask the villagers for some spears, and they wonder why. But at this moment, taking that spear, he simply prepares it. After he prepared it, he closed his eyes. He ends up gathering a little bit of mana. And after he opens his eyes, and only then, he throws the spear. And the spear he threw gained a gigantic momentum and ended up flying at extreme speed towards the castle. And only after it reached the castle, it managed to destroy the primary gate. And only after it destroyed it, the goddess and the rest of the villagers were all left open-mouthed. The castle guards didn't understand what was happening at all, and they even wondered what happened. But our protagonist raised his hand and said that it was all over. Meanwhile, on the other hand, the goddess just laughed at everything. But he told the people to be prepared. Everyone got ready, and after a long time, the people in the castle looked in another direction, where the damage had come from, and realized that some weak people from that village were coming in that direction. Then, realizing that people were coming that way, the general appears and asks them not to panic. They just need to hold off any kind of intruder. And also, this was just some revolt that was surrounding them. Besides, they are weak people, so they could easily be knocked down. And there is no way, not even one of those villagers can knock him down. He was the strongest here. But at this moment, when he talks about this, his hand appears, and this hand manages to completely break his shield and makes him fly up. He looks up and realizes that there were some archers up there and also some guards who were well trained. He knew that the villagers would not be able to deal with them, so he advances and manages to knock down each one of them. Meanwhile, behind him, the villagers manage to knock down the weaker guards. After a long time, they manage to invade the castle and manage to catch the Lord right away. The Lord finds himself again in a situation where he has been captured by our protagonist again, and this time, he won't be able to escape and get away with it this time. However, the villagers, irritated, end up wondering who wouldn't get away with it was the Lord. Besides, they won't be following orders from a lord like that. However, he still thought these guys were two filthy commoners. However, The goddess looks at the protagonist and realizes that he was going to do something. He starts to remember this guy. He knew he wouldn't stop here now. So he simply ends up untying his rope, and only then he comments that he will be freeing him, which makes the villagers behind him wonder why he was doing this. The goddess, on the other hand, ends up being surprised. The Lord, on the other hand, gets irritated by this. Now free, he starts to ask the protagonist what the catch was. He said that it wasn't any, because he just wanted to free him, so he could be running away from here. Since he was a poor guy, he won't be charging anything this time. He could be running away, and this time, he could be running, which makes him angry, asking him not to make fun of him. He was a mere lord. Compared to him, he was nothing. He was the ruler of this entire country. However, he gets angry about this, wondering what he was trying to do. He basically said he could run, which meant to him that he would be worthless, which our protagonist confirms that he would not even be worth a single gold coin, something that the protagonist, on the other hand, even wonders if he really would be worth anything. He gets quite angry about this. So he leaves, saying that he will be remembering a lot of what our protagonist did. Then he leaves and ends up disappearing there. So the people of the village end up wondering why he did this. If he, by chance, decides to come back, he will be retaliating. And now, he will be taking even more revenge. But he said that everything was under control. That Lord failed in his mission. And in the direction he just went was his next fortress. So if he happens to attack that, and also if he invades it, and he is able to catch it, he ends up thinking that he is going to be charging a high price to pay a ransom for it. So if he happens to catch it and capture it, and he doesn't charge, not even charge any gold for its ransom, he will be very disheartened about it, and his pride will be completely gone. And according to the map, there were seven structures on the site, and 6 fortresses, properties remained there. Maybe this will be the cost of basically breaking the agreement, and also having aimed an attack towards our protagonist and his village. But now, there were only 6 more times. So, he needed to destroy 6 castles, and with that, he will be able to crush his pride completely. After a good time of rest, the goddess ends up wondering where the protagonist would go. However, he reveals that he will be going to the Lord. He will be attacking the next place where he fled. However, this was not the point she wanted to get to. For her, she wanted to get to the point where our protagonist's final objective was, as she ends up summarizing that he will need a condition for his victory. To do this, then, he ends up speaking the Lord's authority. He basically needed to wear him down to his limit. And if the Lord is completely humiliated because of that rebellion there in the small village, which is completely unknown to anyone, his reputation, which was perhaps already low, will be completely ruined by them. And for that, he needs to have the cooperation of the villagers. That's what she understood. Our protagonist even understands that his thinking speed was fast. However, the scene changes to another castle. In the castle, we see everything blur, until the protagonist picks up another spear and breaks the gate. The moment he breaks it, he advances and ends up wondering if by chance the Lord was there. The Lord, on the other hand, ends up picking up the binoculars he was using and throws them on the ground, and he gets angry. He was just one person. At one point here, he thought he was killing him. However, he ends up thinking of another way, which is to drag his protagonist here with him, since he will do all of this. He will be personally killing him. His servant ends up ignoring his words a little. However, this irritates him a lot. Angry now, he thinks to himself, that the guards here are totally strong, and there are at least 300 of them. 300 guards out there. Maybe this is different from before, but back to the fight. We see the guards advancing, but the protagonist quickly manages to knock each one of them down. But the guards still persisted in wanting to knock the protagonist down. But one by one, they were knocked down. Realizing that his guards were not enough, he thinks of a way to escape. They need to run to the next castle. So before he can run, he points towards 2 of his butlers. He points there, asking them to ambush the protagonist, beg or do anything, just delay him a little longer. Knowing this then, he ends up thinking of a winning strategy. A strategy to beat the protagonist. With that, he will easily beat him. He then starts until he calls him a fool in his mind. Smiling, he ends up being surprised by his guards who were there and by his butlers. who end up asking him to look ahead. Looking ahead, he realizes that the village were there, surrounding him, and he realizes that he fell into an ambush, and now he's been captured. On the ground, all tied up, we see our protagonist only later saying that it was good to meet him again. This time, then, our protagonist approaches his villagers and wonders what they're doing this time. He gets irritated and wonders why he was leaving all that responsibility on the villagers. He wonders why not. After all, it wasn't him who captured the Lord, it was the villagers themselves. Besides, there was nothing else that could be done. However, he ends up thinking in his mind that he wasn't joking. Besides, he won't be letting these villagers make their choice about what will happen to this lord. So he says that he decides everything, and if that's really his rush, there's nothing else he can do. He was easy to capture, and it's absurd to be captured so easily again, which means that this would perhaps lose its value. Then he turns to the villagers and wonders what they thought of this. He winked at that villager, and after he blinked, he ends up thinking of a plan. And only then, he goes ahead and comments there that he won't be leaving Get Out of Here so easily. He then wonders what he was trying to do, but it doesn't matter. For this, the prey was very easy to capture. So, like that, he lets it escape. Escaping, he ends up disappearing there in the background. And only after, he turns to the villagers and ends up saying that it was bad. He ended up letting it escape. But they understand that it was easy to capture him. So, he doesn't need to worry. And to tell the truth, the villagers were basically happy with the humiliation he was inflicting on that lord. But now, they could be advancing again to be able to capture the lord again. So, he ends up wondering how far this lord will be able to go. So then, they end up retreating and advances the next day to the house there in the other mansion and captures him. After that, he captures him, he releases him, and only after he releases him, he gets angry. But after a long time later, he invades another castle and ends up finding him. After meeting him here and there, and then there, and letting him go, he is completely exhausted at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, he was so devalued that the protagonist doesn't even want to play with this lord anymore. But, tired of humiliating the lord like this, our video today is almost over. But it hasn't come yet, because the protagonist is still going to have to humiliate this guy more and more. He even ends up proposing to pay him an extra 1 million so that he would stop, basically, humiliating him like this. And after being captured 1, 2, or 3 times by our protagonist, he ends up being captured for good. And this time, when he is captured, he says he can escape whenever he wants. However, our hero insists that he was too persistent in wanting to escape from our protagonist. In this situation, even the goddess appears and thinks that this guy was too terrible. Even after being captured so many times, he still hasn't given up. However, our tired hero has already said he understands everything, and for today, he will go. And for today, he will be taking a break and will be collecting a ransom there so that he can escape. 1 million cells. The same one who until now was sad becomes happy. For him, this will be the perfect amount for him to pay, since for him it was nothing. However, there is a condition, that is, so that he can annul the village contract. And his face ends up kind of answering everything. He doesn't understand almost anything. And for that, he ends up explaining that the village has just declared its independence against him. So, as for why, they don't even need to basically declare independence, and there's no need to explain why they're doing this. And for that, we see the memory of the past, that a group of assassins came to our hero's life to eliminate him, but for free the goddess's help. Nothing happened. And not only that, he also hired a beast tamer so that those beasts could also be destroying our hero's village, and he also ends up thinking that he was playing by his rules, and about paying a ransom that is also equal to their value. But he doesn't have many complaints, and so there's nothing else to do. He'll be taking advantage of the situation to accept their proposal. And besides, that small village gaining independence, that means almost nothing to him. And anyway, he'll be accepting it. Our hero, after hearing this, ends up feeling kind of proud, since that small village ended up defeating him, leaving him speechless. And then he ends up putting into practice the contracts he wants. First, he'll be paying 1 million cells. and then he'll be recognizing their independence, and then he'll be making a non-aggression pact for a whole year. With the paper in hand, he ends up taking it to him and then ends up explaining that these are his new contracts. And then, handing him the paper, he takes it and holds it, and only then begins to investigate. He asks him to sign it with his own blood. The villagers who were there watching all this approach our hero and end up realizing that most likely this guy was the type who, if he turned his back, would be attacking him and his village. So they should be a little careful, because they would open up loopholes so that he could counterattack him and his village. But our hero told them not to worry. And anyway, they won't be attacking them, since this time they will have to sign this agreement, which then leaves his villagers a little confused. He then ends up explaining that by paying a proper ransom, they will be preserving a little more of their pride, and also the independence of a troubled village, through which they may be saving themselves a gigantic headache by signing that contract there. And also they can basically avoiding injuries from groups of his soldiers. And also the political instability caused by them, because those injuries were gigantic, not to mention 7 mansions and fortresses that were lost in that time. And considering all that, a 1-year non-aggression pact is not enough for him to be able to easily recover that in just 1 year. And that's why this is a contract and a golden deal for them. And at this moment, the Big Tooth only retreats as quickly as possible. The villagers who saw this realized that they had seen this before. It was like deja vu, only they don't care for more than a little while, because now they are free. Now they have independence. Some of them even think they are celebrating. The goddess approaches our hero and notices that he was laughing maliciously. Asking him this, ends up remembering the show that Big Tooth he put on. However, the goddess said something there that our hero was going to say. He even thinks that she read his mind. But no. She said, "I watched it firsthand." And also not reading minds to catch spoilers was a good option for her now. And it also doesn't make sense for them to value our hero's mind anymore, because she could be watching all of this from here in the first seat in the front row. But for him, in our hero's view, it was practically a VIP seat and right in front of our hero. Something that our hero doesn't care so much about, since as long as he manages to make the gods happy and in the end brings some beasts to our protagonist, he will be doing the basics to be our entertainment for her. And so, they talk about it for a long time. But our time passes, and a few days later, we find someone telling Lord Stackamore to do a good job, since he has now, at this moment, become the leader of this village. Our hero, on the other hand, says he will do his best, and so he says goodbye to his villagers. Then, the goddess appears again by his side, saying goodbye to the third group that has been with our protagonist so far. He is happy, because the news about the Lord's failure to overthrow our hero as Lord of the village has spread to a good part of the neighboring villages. At first, he expected that it would at least spread a little slowly, but it was happening faster than he had imagined. The goddess appears, and ends up saying that the connections they made helped a lot in this. That was true. The explanations themselves were a little vague, but he comments that the nearby villages are connected by some magical contracts as well, and that previous chief ended up signing this contract, and this contract seemed to have some kind of magical effect. And if he knew anything, it is that this contract should be obeyed in a very obedient way. That is what he heard, since in the first place, the lord of this place was weak as a ruler, and also he also does not doubt. He also does not doubt that someone really so loyal to that disgusting lord exists. And now that the lord's influence is waning, the lord's supporters will probably want to suck up to the next ruler, who has gigantic potential, an influential figure or someone closer to him or her. But it seems that the lord has not seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation he is in, and it seems that when he realizes this, it will already be too late. And the expression he will be making will be priceless, something that our protagonist then understands. And he even ends up wondering why she doesn't go there and see for herself, since she has the power to do so. But she, and he too, comment that this was also true, but compared to him, that man's life is not that significant to her, since not even popcorn in hand and a TV right next to it wouldn't make her stay stuck watching that. And also, in any case, the incident will make the story a little more interesting. and he was anxious to see what will happen in the future. But then a villager from his village appears and calls for him. Calling him in such a hurry, our protagonist just gets closer and starts to wonder what was happening. Why all this euphoria? Then he comments that what he wanted to say was an emergency. As soon as he talks about an emergency, he even thinks it was that buck-toothed lord again. But no, he ends up commenting that a certain chief from Light Village was here, which leaves our protagonist a little surprised. Instead of sending a messenger, the village chief himself came in person. So then, he ends up wondering why the village chief came here in person. To this end, the villager who came to our protagonist ends up explaining that the village chief came here in person to offer his own daughter as a bride to our protagonist, leaving our hero completely alarmed. He doesn't believe it. Even the goddess who was there listening to this starts to laugh. Things that were going in a boring direction start to get more interesting. However, our scene changes to another location. And here, our hero approaches another lord from another village. After waiting a little, he thanks him for waiting there. So he approaches and introduces himself as Sakamore. As soon as he recognizes our protagonist, he ends up introducing himself as Lord. And then, he also ends up introducing his daughter, whose codename was Mina. After introducing her, the Lord ends up asking her to introduce herself to our hero. She ends up saying that it's good to meet our protagonist. The Lord, realizing that she wasn't very polite, just asks her to be a little more polite. However, our hero ends up realizing that this was that kind of political marriage, and its purpose was to strengthen their own bonds. The goddess, who was just observing all this, realizes that the girl herself was beautiful. However, part of it seems that she wasn't that excited about this thing. And also, judging by her own attitude, she was probably that spoiled daughter of the village chief, and now she was sent with the purpose of getting married. And it's very likely that she would be quite unhappy with this. Our hero, of course, realizes this right away. Although she is sulking in herself, he realizes that she was a cute girl. And also, if nothing had happened, she would basically be living her life with the sole purpose of being instructed to get married to some village chiefs out there. After a while, our protagonist stares at her for a while. Staring, he thinks about some things. But our scene changes to a house. Inside the house, they start talking about how the alliance he wanted to make there was to strengthen his own territory. After saying this, the Lord ends up asking him to humbly accept his proposal, so that he could marry her. In this situation, after saying this, we see the goddess laughing at our protagonist. However, we see that our hero proposed to have some tea first, and this tea was brought to him by that merchant. However, after observing the whole situation that was happening, Mina ends up opening her mouth, saying that she doesn't want to have this tea. No, this tea is bitter. After saying this, the Lord asks her to calm down a little. Then he ends up changing the subject. He turns to him and comments that he was an incredible person. He even managed to defeat the boss. However, after meeting our protagonist in person, she ends up commenting that he was too skinny. And the difference compared to other men was huge. And for her, even more impressive, the merchant Kimon is more impressive than our hero. He ends up apologizing for what she says. Our hero, only then, hearing this, says that he was fine. He doesn't care about it. And if he really is going to keep smiling, it gives a very bad impression of him. And she also starts to wonder if it was really him who expelled the Lord from this territory. Saying this, the Lord asks her to calm down even more. However, she continues to explain a few more things there, that her own territory was much bigger than his. The villager who listened to all this then ends up saying that it is so much bigger than why she was here. Of course, that was true. Our hero, who was just there listening to all this, ends up understanding that she meant that she is sure that he was not good enough for her. And if he really wasn't enough, our goddess by his side appears, giving him a great hint. She despises our protagonist. But why doesn't our protagonist show her his true strength? And since she doesn't think they're a good match, the two of them will only need to do one simple thing. This was just to prove her wrong. Sakamore realizes the girl is implying he isn't good enough for her, making him sweat nervously. The goddess whispers to him, suggesting that all he has to do is prove his worth to the young woman. She grins mischievously, adding that if the girl thinks they are not a match, they will simply have to prove her wrong. He panics and tries to stop the goddess, insisting they should calmly organize the alliance terms first. The goddess questions the need for more talk, pointing out the village already offered food and even their daughter. The hero admits that the deal is favorable, but only when viewed solely from his village's perspective. Kimon explains that the other village is seeking an alliance because they heard about their victory over the former lord. Sakamore understands this is not an alliance of equals, as the other village is actually seeking his protection. He realizes that forming an alliance means his village will also become responsible for protecting theirs. Considering this new burden, the terms no longer seem so favorable, and he wonders how to handle the negotiation. The goddess excitedly suggests they start by putting the spoiled girl in her place to solve the real issue. Without waiting for an answer, she snaps her fingers, ready to put her plan into action immediately. Suddenly, a sound like thunder rumbles outside, startling everyone in the room as they look around in confusion. A villager bursts in, frantically telling the chief to come outside because something terrible is happening. They rush out to find the sky has abruptly turned dark under a full moon, leaving everyone bewildered. The moon continues to move, slowly covering the sun and causing a shocking solar eclipse in broad daylight. The villagers stare in awe and fear. The hero explains it is a solar eclipse but adds that it is not the right time of year for one. He quickly deduces this must be the goddess's work, though he fails to see how it solves the alliance issue. As the unnatural eclipse hangs in the sky, a sense of dread spreads through the crowd of onlookers. A villager shouts in alarm, claiming something is happening on the other side as well, an event unlike anything he has ever heard of. The visiting lord and his daughter are terrified. The lord mutters that he should have never come to this strange village. An elder from the village looks up with conviction, declaring that this phenomenon is undoubtedly the work of the gods. He stands among his people, confidently announcing that this is a sign from the goddess protecting their home. The visiting chief remembers that the previous leader of this village was known for being deeply invested in religious rites. A villager adds that the former chief even claimed he could see the goddess himself when they first built her statue. At that moment, the goddess appears before the hero, cheerfully telling him to leave the finishing touches to her. Her sudden appearance and confident words leave the young chief completely stunned and speechless once again. Suddenly, someone in the crowd points to a bright glow in the distance, identifying its location as the goddess statue. The wooden statue of the goddess begins to radiate a brilliant, divine light, bathing its surroundings in a golden hue. The entire group, including the visitors, stares in disbelief, while a villager asks the chief what is happening. The goddess's voice rings in the hero's mind, telling him his true strength lies in his ability to speak with the divine. She continues, explaining there is one thing only he can do, which is to act as her messenger. Realizing her plan, Sakamore smiles and confidently announces to the crowd that he has received a message from the gods. He turns to the visitors, his voice echoing with authority, and declares that the gods are not pleased. The hero's words are directed at the chief's daughter, whose arrogant attitude suggested she was above a chief who connects with the gods. Terrified, the girl and her father ask what they should do, so Sakamore suggests they reconsider the terms of their alliance. The glowing statue speaks, demanding to see their sincerity and proof that their village is worthy of protection. The visiting chief, completely intimidated, stammers that he understands and promises they will do as he says. Sakamore then tells them that the gods have spoken and now ask for patience while they deliberate their fate. As he finishes speaking, the brilliant light from the statue fades, and the divine presence seems to retreat. The unnatural eclipse ends, and the sun shines brightly in the sky once more, returning normalcy to the day. The young chief smiles at the visitors, telling them it seems the gods have granted them some time. The once arrogant girl now looks flustered and humbled by the display of divine power she just witnessed. Her father bows low, promising to revise the alliance terms and begging Sakamore to convey their sincerity to the gods. After they leave, the goddess remarks that it went well, and the hero agrees that managing things is easy with such a setup. The goddess states that thanks to this display, negotiations with other villages should also go smoothly. He agrees, realizing the other villages seeking alliances must have also seen the unnatural solar eclipse. On top of that, word of the divine event will spread, and other villages will likely offer extraordinary terms for an alliance. The goddess smiles, pleased that the prosperity of the village seems all but guaranteed now. But before he can relax, she snaps her fingers again, announcing it is time to move on to the next issue. Suddenly, Sakamore feels an unexpected and powerful physical reaction, causing him to blush and look panicked. He shouts in confusion and embarrassment, not understanding what is happening to his own body. The goddess cheerfully reminds him that the prosperity of the village also depends on his own prosperity. As he stands there flushed and tense, the other villagers look at him with concern, asking what is wrong. He quickly apologizes, claims he has a sudden stomachache, and runs off to hide his embarrassment. He dashes inside a building, clutching his stomach and trying to calm down from the unexpected situation. The goddess appears, playfully teasing him that it was just a natural male phenomenon and there was no need to rush off. He retorts that it is not a natural reaction to have after seeing someone off, knowing she is deliberately messing with him. He sighs in frustration, admitting he does not want to carry a power that he can no longer control. The goddess simply says she understands, but then points out that he avoided using beams when he attacked the Lord's fortress. Instead, he opted for spears and hand-to-hand combat, because the purpose of that fight was different from a simple display of power. He tells the goddess that while having strong power is good, it would be better if she could give him something easier to control. The goddess crosses her arms, understanding what he is saying but firmly refusing his request without hesitation. When he asks why, she cheekily replies that returns and exchanges are not accepted, annoying him as she pulls the phrase from his mind. She explains that if an ordinary person were to gain immense power, they would likely use it for their own selfish desires, but she points out that he is different, as he struggles to use that power properly instead of abusing it. He even avoids using his full strength while trying to figure out the best way to move forward in any given situation. She smiles warmly, admitting that his cautious and responsible nature is precisely why she has recently come to like him. Her sudden and sincere compliment leaves the young chief blushing and completely taken by surprise. She then asks if his approach could be called a self-imposed challenge, once again borrowing a phrase directly from his thoughts. He sighs in resignation, lamenting that there are no returns or exchanges on the power he has been given. The goddess cheerfully confirms his conclusion, leaving him to accept his unique circumstances. He decides he will just have to keep experimenting and innovating to learn how to use his powerful ability. He adds that he will do so since she seems to enjoy watching his struggle, and she enthusiastically agrees. The scene then transitions to a peaceful view of the village, suggesting the conversation has ended for now. Sometime later, an elder from another village loudly declares his group's intention to swear their loyalty. They all bow before their new leader, Hajime, formally pledging their allegiance to him and his village. The hero sweats nervously, thinking to himself that the double solar eclipse was a very effective, if not slightly excessive tactic. He calmly asks the men to raise their heads, wanting to address them on equal footing before continuing the discussion. The chief explains that speaking for the gods is a grave matter, but he can assure them of one thing. He promises that as long as they lead peaceful lives, no divine punishment will ever befall them or their people. One of the visiting elders, overcome with emotion, fervently swears that he will never betray Chief Hajime. The other men quickly follow his lead, bowing low once again and shouting their renewed oath of loyalty. As the meeting continues, one of the visitors shyly offers his daughter in marriage to Chief Hajime to seal their bond. Soon, other men chime in with similar offers, leaving Hajime to quietly contemplate the complexities of political marriage. The goddess playfully suggests he marry them all, but he rejects the idea, knowing it would create issues with heirs and status. Hajime decides to postpone any discussion about marriage and daughters, much to the disappointment of the eager elders. Changing the subject, he tells a villager to bring something more important for their new allies. The villager hands out several cloth-wrapped packages to the visiting men, who accept them with confused looks. Hajime then holds up a large white banner with a red circle, presenting it as the official symbol of their new alliance. He tells them to display the banner prominently as a sign of their alliance, a command that initially confuses the elders. An elder examines the flag, asking if the red emblem is meant to represent the sun. Hajime confirms this, declaring that the sun represents all members of the alliance and will never wane. Reminded of the terrifying solar eclipse they just witnessed, the men are once again overwhelmed and swear their absolute loyalty. As the visitors' carriages depart, Hajime and the goddess watch them go, the sun setting over the peaceful landscape. The goddess turns to him, remarking that he is truly amusing, a comment that makes him pause. She explains that no one reincarnated into this world has ever brought their homeland's flag with them before. He explains that since the double solar eclipse made such a strong impression, his country's sun-themed flag was a perfect fit. The goddess smiles, telling him that with this act, he has planted a flag and laid the foundation for a new nation. Hajime thinks back on his past life, remembering the toxic work environments and cruel bosses he endured. He recalls being overworked, belittled, and treated as disposable, a foundation built on the sacrifice of others. He declares his desire to create a nation where people can truly enjoy their lives and feel joy for being a part of it. He envisions a nation where citizens like the visiting girl and her father will never say their country is doomed. Even the diligent merchant Kimon and his workers will be part of this new prosperous society he plans to build. Hajime smiles with determination, knowing he has many things to organize to make his ambitious dream a reality. Hajime resolves to use his past experiences to build a new nation here, starting with his village and then the allied ones. The goddess then teases him, finding it rare that he rejected all the marriage offers even though she thought he might like someone. He recalls the women offered to him and admits that while there was a political angle, he simply was not interested in any of them. She calls him picky for someone with so little romantic experience, prompting him to tell her to be quiet in annoyance. Her eyes begin to glow as she decides to see how he really feels inside, making him tell her to wait. He wonders what she is talking about, thinking that if it is his subconscious, he would not be aware of it himself. The goddess stands before him, asking if he wants to know the real reason he did not accept any of the marriage proposals. She then poses, revealing that he was not interested because he finds the god more alluring than any mortal woman. His companion adds that this is why no other woman could tempt him, leaving the young chief completely shocked. He tries to process this, thinking that since it is a subconscious feeling, there is no way for him to confirm if it is true. Looking at the goddess floating before him, he begins to wonder if what she said could actually be right. He quietly asks himself if it is possible that he is truly in love with the god standing in front of him. However, she bluntly tells him that is not it, leaving him confused and asking what she means then. She turns away, stating that she would not talk about such shallow feelings, which only confuses him more. She then clarifies she meant her own feelings for him, confirming they are indeed feelings of love. Stunned by her confession, Hajime stands awkwardly in a field of hearts, unsure how to respond to her words. He shyly admits that he does not really dislike her confession, his face blushing as he speaks. The young chief is still flustered, his mind racing to understand the goddess's unexpected declaration of love. She smiles warmly and formally declares that she will accompany him until death do them part, though he points out she was going to do that anyway. She continues, telling him that as someone who walks alongside the god, he must serve a certain purpose. The goddess cryptically tells him to become a sacrifice to the circle, leaving him confused and unnerved by her words. The next day, the banner of the new alliance flutters in the wind, a symbol of hope and unity for the villages. Hajime walks through his village, warmly greeting everyone he passes as they return the gesture with smiles. The villagers greet their chief with enthusiasm, happy to see him and grateful for the new sense of security he has brought. He stops to chat with a family, sharing a laugh with them and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of his home. Despite the calm, he still worries about the goddess's words, wondering what being an offering to the circle means. He resolves to face whatever comes, remembering his previous encounter with a terrain beast and hoping not to be eaten again. The goddess reminds him to do something useful for the villagers as the one who delivers the will of the gods. He recalls the merchant's words about an eventual opportunity, but he still feels nervous about the unknown future. The scene ends with a view of the village's thriving farmlands, a testament to their hard work and growing prosperity. Hajime stands with the goddess, admiring the peaceful view of his village and commenting that it never gets old. Some villagers working in a nearby field see him and call out, so he waves and greets them in return. One of the villagers approaches and Hajime asks if something is wrong, noticing his worried expression. The man explains that while the village is more prosperous than ever thanks to him, he has a small problem. He has been trying to work his old farm again to be self-sufficient, but the poor quality of the soil is making it difficult. Hajime is touched by the villagers' hard-working and independent spirit, feeling proud to have such wonderful people in his village. He considers the problem, having already tried basic fertilizer made from waste without much success. Using high-grade store-bought fertilizer would be too expensive, especially considering the size of the field and shipping costs. The goddess tells him he worries too much, but her comment is heard by the villagers, not just Hajime. The men are startled, wondering if they just heard a divine revelation directly from the gods. Hajime awkwardly confirms their suspicion, trying to play along with the unexpected turn of events. The villagers' eyes sparkle with excitement as they realize their chief can truly communicate with the divine. Hajime then asks the goddess what she meant by needless worry, so she decides to offer him some divine guidance. He follows her instructions and leads the villagers to a specific spot, asking if this is the right place. In the middle of an empty patch of land, there is a simple square wooden frame dug into the ground. Hajime explains the process, instructing them to alternate layers of manure and straw in the wooden frame. He tells them that in a few months, this mixture will decompose and become a powerful fertilizer. The villagers are skeptical, as the method does not seem very different from what they usually do. Hajime simply smiles and tells them to trust him, as this is the will of the gods. Convinced by his divine authority, the villagers eagerly agree to make a large batch and gather anyone free to help. Hajime later explains that while they knew manure could be used as fertilizer, their ratio was inefficient. The goddess thinks he is the village's guardian deity for lending them such divine knowledge, but he tells her she is wrong. He clarifies that the knowledge came from an old memory of a video he half-watched while dozing off on a train. The goddess then teases him by revealing his subconscious thoughts about women, making him cover his face in embarrassment. She calmly tells him that wanting to mark one's mate is only natural and a sign of being wise. Just then, a villager runs up to them, interrupting their conversation with some urgent news. He breathlessly informs Hajime that Mr. Kimon, the merchant, has arrived and is here to see him. Kimon approaches with a smile, greeting Hajime warmly and apologizing for the sudden visit. Hajime assures him it is no bother and suggests they talk in a more private spot, to which Kimon gratefully agrees. Once they are alone, Kimon gets straight to the point, telling Hajime he has come to ask about the 7 deadly sins. Before Hajime can respond, Kimon mentions the rumors about him receiving divine revelations and gets straight to the point. He directly asks Hajime if there is any way he can prove his connection to the gods. Kimon clarifies that even if Hajime simply anticipated natural phenomena and took advantage of them, that would still be acceptable. However, he wisely advises Hajime to play it shrewd when dealing with lords and other higher-ups in the future. He warns that if they demand proof of divine revelation and Hajime cannot provide it, the situation could become dangerous. The goddess decides this is the perfect time to intervene and snaps her fingers, ready to provide the proof Kimon seeks. A powerful aura surrounds Hajime, and he feels a surge of divine energy flowing through his body. Kimon stares in utter shock, his eyes wide with disbelief at the incredible sight before him. Intricate golden patterns appear on Hajime's clothes and skin, glowing with a divine light. The markings spread across his face and neck, and he realizes this must be the divine offering the goddess spoke of. Kimon is completely speechless, realizing that Hajime truly is something else entirely. As the marks begin to fade, Kimon says that with this proof, Hajime has more legitimacy than any lord, perhaps even the emperor. Hajime mutters the word offering to himself, still trying to grasp the full meaning of what just happened. A beautiful divine image appears, showing Hajime and the goddess locked in a heavenly embrace. The goddess smiles and explains that the marks are a divine symbol, identifying him as her chosen partner. Several decades later, an older Hajime walks with the goddess through a dense forest, complaining that he can't find what he's looking for. The goddess jokingly suggests that perhaps what he's looking for has been buried too deep over the years. He dismisses her suggestion, and she asks him what makes him so sure she's wrong. He explains that he knows she's enjoying the situation, because if he were truly being deceived, she would seem much more bored. Now 45, Sakimori Hajime confidently tells him that, instead, she seems eager to see how he will act. He adds that she doesn't need to read people, as her emotions are always clearly visible on her face, which is her only weakness. He smiles, realizing that this makes him the only man who knows the goddess's weakness, even though she holds his life in her hands. Suddenly, the ground begins to shake violently, taking them both completely by surprise. Hajime initially thinks it's an earthquake, but soon realizes something else is causing the tremors. A monstrous, worm-like creature with a massive jaw bursts from the ground and flies toward them. The creature's body glows with a menacing red energy as it prepares to attack its unsuspecting targets. Hajime braces himself for the fight, getting into a ready stance as the massive beast approaches them. As the monster crashes back to the ground, it creates a powerful shockwave, and Hajime finally understands what it is. He looks at the enormous lizard-like creature, awed by its immense size and powerful presence. Knowing that the locals are having trouble with this beast, he prepares to fight, readying to use his unique abilities. the divine markings appear once again on his face as he tells the creature that it will have to go. He summons several magic circles around himself, channeling an immense amount of divine power for his next attack. A massive beam of pure energy erupts from his body, striking the giant beast with devastating force. The beam completely destroys the creature, leaving only a trail of destruction in its wake. Hajime looks at the scorched path, satisfied with the result and the demonstration of his incredible power. Sometime later, he arrives at a large city with a castle overlooking the houses, the next step in his plan. The townspeople go about their daily lives, oblivious to the momentous changes about to occur. The Japanese flag now flies over the town, a clear symbol of their new loyalty and protection. Hajime addresses the town lord, declaring that the territory is now part of Nippon and under the goddess's protection. The lord thanks him profusely, grateful for being added to Hajime's nation and for having the Forest Lord defeated. Hajime then tells the Lord that there is one more thing he must do before the transition is complete. He activates his divine markings once more, his face glowing with a holy light as he prepares to give his next command. The town lord looks on in awe, recognizing the markings as a sign of a true blessing from the gods. He realizes this means they have received permission to make a sacred pilgrimage, and Hajime confirms his assumption. Hajime instructs the current lord and all the senior citizens to prepare for their pilgrimage and to select a new lord as discussed. He tells them that though the journey will be long, God will welcome the faith of those who persevere. The elders, now dressed as pilgrims, wave to the younger generation as they set out on their sacred journey. The goddess praises Hajime's persuasive speech, summarizing her plan to remove the old authority and give the young a chance. Hajime explains that this world is built on hierarchy and seniority, where the weak and young are exploited and have no room to grow. He believes they need to educate leaders and promote the young, using the world's strong faith as a tool for change. The goddess points out that the pilgrimage roads are well paved, free of monsters, and have rest stops everywhere. She realizes that the Holy Land is primarily a school and an infrastructure center, not a place of pure spiritual enlightenment. Hajime smiles, saying that people would be surprised at how much fun learning can be when they are older, and that faith begins with knowledge. He recalls the once arrogant lord, now a student of geopolitics, proving that people truly can change. Hajime knows his grand plan only works because he has a real god supporting him every step of the way. The goddess playfully scolds him, asking how he dares to use a god like that, calling him a heathen. With the old guard gone, Hajime declares that it is now the young one's time to shine and lead. He continues to fight alongside his people, clearing out any remaining threats and securing their lands. He battles fierce beasts, protecting the growing nation and ensuring the safety of its citizens. The flag of Nippon flies proudly over the expanding territory, a symbol of hope, progress, and a brighter future for all. Hajime and his allies stand over a large map, planning the expansion of their new nation, Nippon. The map shows the vast territory that has now been united under the banner of the rising sun. Years later, Kimon lies peacefully in a coffin, having lived a full life and passed away surrounded by beauty. His friends and comrades mourn his passing, their faces filled with sadness at the loss of a great man. The goddess greets Hajime with a smile, telling him that he is finally awake from a long rest. An elderly Hajime lies in bed, looking up at the goddess who has been by his side for his entire life. He remarks that his head feels clearer than usual, a sign that his time is drawing to a close. The goddess simply smiles, telling him that it is good he feels clear-headed in his final moments. He asks her if he is going to die, his voice calm and accepting of his fate. She confirms his suspicion, telling him that he has less than an hour left to live. He accepts her words with a simple, "I see." His eyes closed as he prepares for the inevitable. He playfully tells her not to read people's minds, referencing an old joke between them from long ago. She notes his lack of reaction to the old meme, a sign of his age and wisdom. She teases him one last time, calling him the Virgin Emperor, based on his title and long life. He quietly says he understands the pun, his voice weak but his mind still sharp as he spends his last moments with her. A montage of his life flashes before his eyes, showing all the battles, friendships, and achievements he has experienced. He looks back on his journey, from a young man in a new world to the emperor of a great nation, and thinks it was a pretty good life. He tells the goddess it is time to leave things to the young people and let the old soldiers rest. having no regrets about his choices. The goddess gently tells him his time is up, and he calmly accepts his fate with a simple "I see." She turns to him and says she would like to keep one last promise they made long ago. She asks him if he is ready to give up, her voice filled with a mix of sadness and playful challenge. He recalls her words from their first meeting, when she said she would keep him alive just long enough to see if he would give up at death. He lies silently for a moment, his eyes closed as he gathers his remaining strength for his final words. The goddess waits patiently, watching over him as he prepares to answer her final question. At last he smiles and declares that he has beaten a god, calling it the best life ever. The goddess looks at him with tears in her eyes, touched by his words and his unwavering spirit. She asks him if he truly has no regrets, wanting to be sure he is at peace with his life and his death. He confirms that he has no regrets, his voice filled with a sense of peace and accomplishment. His only wish is that they could have had more quiet time together, a simple but heartfelt desire. That is his only regret as his vision fades to black, his long and incredible journey finally coming to an end. The goddess's voice echoes in the darkness, playfully calling him rude for having regrets after beating a god. Hajime's consciousness stirs, a flicker of awareness returning to him in the void. He sees the goddess reaching out to him, her image coming into focus as he slowly regains his senses. He sits up abruptly, completely shocked to find himself alive and back in his own bed. He leaps out of bed and rushes to a mirror, trying to understand what has just happened to him. He stares at his reflection in disbelief, realizing he is young again and back to the beginning of his journey. The goddess explains that a god losing to a human is disgraceful, but forcing him to give up would also be her loss. She looks at him with a mischievous glint in her eyes, wondering if he understands what she is implying. With a wide grin, she declares that they are going into extra innings, a second chance for him to live his life. Hajime is completely stunned, shouting in disbelief at the prospect of going through everything all over again. Just then, a servant enters the room, asking how His Majesty is feeling, unaware of the miracle that has occurred. The servant is shocked to see the emperor looking as he did in his youth, his face filled with utter amazement. Hajime awkwardly waves, not quite sure how to explain the impossible situation he now finds himself in. The servant declares it a miracle, realizing that the emperor has grown young again after being on the verge of death. He runs out of the room, shouting about the miracle of the gods, leaving Hajime to face his new reality. The goddess tells him that he has achieved the gift of immortality, something rulers have sought for all time. He argues that even though he looks younger, he has already ruled for a long time and does not want to lead the nation again. His old comrades rush in, their faces filled with joy and excitement at seeing their emperor young and healthy again. One of them exclaims that Hajime looks just like he did when they first met, and he is happy to keep learning from him. Another friend, though remembering some hard times, acknowledges that Hajime helped the land flourish and vows to see this through with him. The third friend is overcome with emotion, thrilled at the chance to serve at his side once more. Hajime tries to refuse, saying they have all retired, but they insist on serving as his retired advisors, pointing out his massive public support. The goddess pats him on the back, a comforting gesture as he faces the overwhelming reality of his new situation. She winks and cheerfully tells him to do his best in his extra innings, calling him Grandpa with a playful smile. He grits his teeth, his face a mix of frustration and determination.